I'm Beth Coleman. Been a ranger in the Adirondack Park for going on 15 years now. Worked everything from visitor services to backcountry rescue. I've seen people do strange things in the wilderness, but nothing prepared me for what I found up near Lake Colden in the fall of 2022. It started with a routine patrol. October 15th, I remember the date because I'd been putting off this particular sweep for weeks. The trail to Flowed Lands gets less traffic after Labor Day, and with budget cuts, we'd been prioritizing the popular spots. But I'd gotten a couple reports from hikers about unusual structures back in the deeper sections, so I finally loaded up my pack and headed out. The morning was crisp, that perfect Adirondack fall weather when the maples are peak color and the air smells like wood smoke and dying leaves. I made good time on the marked trails, checking campsites and lean-tos as I went. Everything looked normal. Clean fire rings, no litter, the usual signs that people had been respectful of the space. It was around noon when I left the main trail system and started bushwhacking toward the coordinates from the reports. The terrain up there is rough old growth, mixed with blowdown from storms, thick understory that grabs at your gear. I was following what looked like an old deer path when I first noticed the disturbances. Someone had been through here recently. Broken branches at shoulder height, boot prints in the soft soil near a seasonal stream. The odd thing was how deliberate it all looked. Not like someone lost or wandering, but like someone with a specific destination in mind. I followed the signs for maybe half a mile before I saw it. The blind was tucked into a natural depression between two massive white pines, maybe 50 yards from a small clearing where deer would come to browse. At first glance, it looked professional. Military surplus camo netting stretched between trees, reinforced with branches and local vegetation. The construction was solid, weatherproof, clearly meant for extended use, but there was nobody around. I called out first. Standard procedure. "Hello, Ranger here. Anyone in the area?" Nothing but the sound of wind through the pines and the distant call of a loon from one of the lakes. I approached carefully. The blind was larger than I'd expected, maybe 8 feet wide and 4 feet deep, with a low roof that would let someone sit comfortably inside for hours. The entrance was a flap of canvas secured with military-style fasteners. Everything about it screamed professional operation. That's when I noticed the camera equipment. Through the open front of the blind, I could see tripods, telephoto lenses, what looked like thousands of dollars worth of gear, all of it arranged with careful precision, like someone had just stepped away for a minute and planned to come right back. I documented everything with my phone before I touched anything, standard practice for unusual finds. Then I pushed aside the canvas flap and looked inside. The setup was impressive. 3 different camera positions, each aimed at slightly different angles of the clearing. A small camp chair, water bottles, energy bars, even a portable battery pack to keep everything charged. On a makeshift shelf made from a flat piece of bark, I found notebooks filled with handwritten observations, times, weather conditions, animal behavior notes. The handwriting was neat, methodical, but what really caught my attention were the memory cards. There were dozens of them, each labeled with dates going back 3 weeks. 21 days of consistent photography, organized by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. I gathered them all up, along with the notebooks, and hiked back to the ranger station to process everything properly. That evening, I started going through the images on my computer. The photographer had been documenting the clearing systematically, capturing everything from sunrise to sunset: deer, squirrels, birds, even insects on flowers. The quality was exceptional. Clearly someone with serious skill and expensive equipment. The dates started on September 24th and ran continuously through October 14th. Thousands of images, sometimes hundreds per day. I could track the gradual change of the seasons, watch individual deer return to the same spots day after day. Whoever had been in that blind had remarkable patience and dedication. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. For one thing, there was no variation in the shooting positions. Every photo was taken from the exact same 3 camera angles. Like the photographer had never moved from the blind. No shots of setting up equipment. No candid moments. Nothing that suggested a human presence behind the cameras. More strange was the timing. The images showed consistent activity throughout each day, from pre-dawn until well after sunset. That would mean someone sitting motionless in that blind for 15, 16 hours at a stretch, day after day for 3 weeks straight. I kept scrolling through the chronological sequence, and that's when I found them. The final series of images, taken on the morning of October 14th, started normally. Dawn light filtering through the trees, a family of deer moving into the clearing to browse. Standard wildlife photography. But then something changed. In the background of several shots, barely visible through the morning shadows, there was movement. At first, I thought it might be another deer, or maybe a bear, passing through the far edge of the clearing. But when I enhanced the images and adjusted the exposure, I could make out a human figure. Someone was approaching the blind from behind. The figure was distant and partially obscured by vegetation, but clearly human, adult height, moving deliberately through the forest toward the photographer's position. The timestamps on these images ran from 5:47 to 5:52 a.m. on October 14th. After that, nothing. No more photos, no more activity. The memory cards ended there. I reported my findings to the supervisor, and we initiated a missing person protocol, posted notices at trailheads, checked with local outfitters and guide services, ran the equipment serial numbers through databases. Nobody reported a missing photographer. No permits had been issued for extended stays in that area. The gear wasn't registered to anyone in our system. 3 days later, we organized a full search. 8 rangers, 2 K9 units, and a helicopter for aerial reconnaissance. We covered a 5-mile radius around the blind, checked every trail, every water source, every possible route someone might have taken. We found nothing. No tracks beyond what I'd already documented. No abandoned gear, no signs of struggle or accident. It was as if whoever had been using that blind had simply vanished. The case stayed active for 2 months before being transferred to state police. They processed the equipment for fingerprints, analyzed the photographs with better software than we had, even brought in a criminal profiler to review the notebooks. Nothing led anywhere. The gear was clean. The photos were exactly what they appeared to be, and the handwriting showed no signs of distress or unusual behavior. Officially, the case remains open but inactive. No crime was proven. No missing person was ever reported. The equipment was eventually transferred to our Lost and Found, where it sits to this day. But I still think about those final photographs. I've gone back to the site 4 times since then, always finding reasons to patrol that area. The blind is gone now. We dismantled it per park policy, but I know exactly where it stood. Sometimes I sit in that clearing and try to imagine what happened that morning. Who was approaching through the trees? Was it someone the photographer knew, or a stranger who discovered the blind? Was it friendly contact, or something else entirely? The thing that bothers me most is the timing. Those final photos were taken at dawn, when most people would be asleep or just starting their day. What kind of person is moving through thick wilderness in pre-dawn darkness, approaching a hidden position with such purpose? And why did the photography stop so abruptly? If it was a planned meeting, why didn't the cameras keep rolling? If it was something unexpected or threatening, why wasn't there any sign of disturbance or hasty departure? I've checked the area for new activity. Any signs that the photographer might have returned? Nothing. Whoever spent 3 weeks documenting that clearing with such obsessive detail has never come back for their expensive equipment or their carefully organized work. Sometimes, on quiet patrols when I'm alone in the woods, I find myself looking over my shoulder more than I used to, wondering if someone might be watching from the shadows, approaching with that same deliberate movement I saw in those final photographs. The wilderness keeps its secrets. In 15 years of ranger work, I've learned that some questions don't have answers, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. But I still think about that empty blind, and I still wonder who was walking through the forest that October dawn. moving toward a photographer who would never take another picture. The equipment is still in our storage room. Sometimes I pass by and wonder if whoever left it there might come back for it someday. Part of me hopes they do, but another part of me isn't sure. I want to know what kind of person spends 3 weeks alone in the wilderness, then disappears without a trace when someone finally finds them. The forest remembers everything, even when we don't understand what it's trying to tell us. I'm Jake Morrison. I've been a wildlife technician with the Forest Service for 8 years now, mostly working camera surveys and habitat monitoring in the Cascade Range. It's methodical work, placing cameras, checking batteries, collecting data. Nothing too exciting, which is how I like it. At least, that's how I liked it until the spring of 2023. We were running a routine elk population study in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, about 40 miles northeast of Seattle. Standard protocol: deploy 24 trail cameras across predetermined grid coordinates, collect data monthly, analyze movement patterns and population density. I'd done the same survey 3 years running, knew every camera location by heart. The trouble started in late March, right after I'd completed the spring deployment. I was doing my first monthly check on April 15th, when I noticed that camera number 7 wasn't where I'd left it. The GPS coordinates on my datasheet put it at the base of a large Douglas fir, about 30 yards from a well-used game trail. But when I hiked to the location, the tree was there. The trail was there, but the camera was gone. At first, I figured someone had stolen it. Happens more than you'd think, especially with the newer models that retail for $400 or $500. But when I expanded my search pattern, I found the camera about a quarter-mile deeper into the forest, strapped to a different tree entirely. Same camera, same serial number, but relocated to a spot I'd never seen before. Dense forest, no trails, terrain so thick you'd need a machete to get through comfortably. Not the kind of place a casual thief would haul stolen equipment. The memory card told a strange story. The camera had been taking its usual motion-activated photos: deer, squirrels, the occasional black bear. But starting around midnight on April 10th, the images showed movement, not wildlife movement, but the camera itself moving. Frame after frame of forest floor, tilted angles, blurred vegetation rushing past the lens. Someone or something had been carrying the camera through the woods in the middle of the night. The sequence ran for about 2 hours, then stopped when the camera was repositioned on its new tree. After that, normal wildlife photos resumed as if nothing had happened. I reported the incident to my supervisor, completed the paperwork, and repositioned the camera back to its original coordinates. Figured it was a one-time thing, maybe some kids playing pranks or a confused hiker who thought they were being helpful. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Same camera, moved even deeper into the restricted wilderness area. This time, the memory card showed a 4-hour journey through terrain I didn't recognize. Steep ravines, old-growth forest, areas that would require serious backcountry experience to navigate safely in daylight, let alone in complete darkness. But here's what really bothered me. The camera was moving in a straight line, not wandering or exploring, but following a direct route towards some specific destination. The time-lapse effect of the images made it look almost like someone was following an invisible map. I started checking the other cameras more frequently, and that's when I realized the problem was spreading. By May, 5 different cameras were migrating, always at night, always moving deeper into the wilderness, always following routes that seemed purposeful rather than random. The memory cards documented these impossible journeys through some of the roughest terrain in the Cascades, areas where even experienced hikers stick to established trails. What made it worse was the consistency. Each camera would move exactly once every 2 weeks, always during the new moon when the darkness was complete. The journeys were getting longer too, sometimes covering 3 or 4 miles in a single night, through terrain that would take me a full day to traverse carefully. I started staying overnight in the forest, trying to catch whoever was moving the equipment. Set up camp near the cameras, used night vision scopes, Even brought a friend from search and rescue to help with surveillance. Never saw anything. The cameras would be there when I went to sleep and gone when I woke up. The memory cards kept documenting these midnight migrations, but they never showed who was doing the carrying. Just hours of forest floor, vegetation, and darkness rushing past the motion sensors. By June, I was losing cameras faster than I could retrieve them. They were moving beyond my mapped survey area into sections of wilderness that weren't even on my detailed topographic chart. Remote areas where the Forest Service hadn't conducted surveys in decades. That's when I decided to follow one of the migration routes. I picked camera number 12, which had moved 3 times and seemed to be following the most consistent path. Using the GPS coordinates from its memory card, I plotted its route and planned a backcountry expedition to track where it was heading. The hike took me 2 days through country I'd never seen before. Old-growth cedar and hemlock. Some of the trees massive enough to drive a truck through. Steep terrain, no maintained trails. The kind of wilderness where you could disappear completely and never be found. I was following a ridgeline on the second day when I started noticing signs of human activity. Not recent activity, but old traces. Cut branches that had healed over years ago. Cairns that had been scattered by weather and time. The faint remnants of what might have been a trail. And then I found the camp. It was tucked into a natural shelf on the mountainside, protected by an overhang of rock and surrounded by thick forest. At first glance, it looked like any other backcountry campsite fire ring. Flat spots where tents had been pitched, areas where gear had been stored. But everything was wrong. The equipment was decades old. Canvas tents rotted to fragments, aluminum pack frames corroded to lace, sleeping bags that had been torn apart by weather and animals. A camp stove that looked like something from the 1970s, rust-seized and useless, but scattered around the perimeter of the campsite, arranged in a perfect circle, were my trail cameras. All 12 of them strapped to trees and rocks, their red recording lights blinking in the forest gloom. Their lenses were pointed inward, toward the center of the abandoned camp, as if they were documenting something that was no longer there. I checked the memory cards immediately. Each camera had been recording continuously since it arrived, some for weeks, some for days. Thousands of images of the empty campsite, taken every few minutes around the clock. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was what the cameras had been documenting before they reached the campsite. During their migrations, in addition to the usual forest floor imagery, there were occasional frames showing other things. Glimpses of old camping equipment being dragged through the woods, fragments of canvas and metal, pieces of gear that matched what I'd found, scattered around the abandoned site. Someone, or something, had been systematically gathering the remnants of that old camp, using my trail cameras to document the process, then arranging everything back at the original location. I spent 3 days at the site, trying to make sense of what I'd found. The campsite showed signs of long-term occupation, but it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. There were personal items scattered through the debris, a water-damaged paperback novel, corroded eating utensils, fragments of maps that were too deteriorated to read. What I couldn't understand was the timeline. The camp had clearly been empty for years before my cameras started migrating. So who had been moving them, and why were they being used to reconstruct and document a campsite that had been abandoned before most of my equipment had even been manufactured? I retrieved all the cameras and hiked back to the ranger station to file my report. My supervisor was understanding but skeptical. Cameras don't move themselves, he pointed out. Someone had to be relocating them. Probably the same people who had originally occupied that backcountry site. But when we ran the coordinates through our database, we found records that complicated that theory. The campsite was in an area that had been closed to public access since 1998 due to unstable terrain and rockfall danger. Before that, it had been part of a research area used by the University of Washington for long-term ecological studies. The last recorded human activity in that location was a graduate student project that had been abandoned in 1991. 32 years ago, we contacted the university and eventually tracked down some records from the original research project. It had been a multi-year study of old-growth forest ecosystems, led by a professor who'd retired years earlier. The graduate student assigned to the remote monitoring station had been named David Chen. According to the files, Chen had been conducting solo research at the backcountry site for 8 months when he stopped reporting in. Search teams found his campsite intact but abandoned, with no sign of where he'd gone or why he'd left all his equipment behind. The case had been closed as a voluntary disappearance. Chen was an experienced outdoorsman, familiar with the area, and there was no evidence of foul play or accident. The assumption was that he'd decided to abandon his research and left the wilderness through an unmapped route, but his campsite had been left exactly as I'd found it, and it had been empty for over 30 years. I never did figure out who was moving my cameras or why they were being used to document that abandoned site. The official report classified it as equipment malfunction combined with human interference. Probably hikers who thought they were being helpful by relocating the cameras to more interesting locations. But I kept copies of all the memory card data, and sometimes I go through the images trying to understand what I was seeing during those midnight migrations. The cameras documented their journeys with mechanical precision, but they never revealed who was carrying them or why they were being drawn to that particular location. What bothers me most is the purposefulness of it all. The cameras weren't moved randomly or as a prank. They were systematically relocated to reconstruct something that had been lost, to document a campsite that someone wanted preserved or remembered. I've been back to the location twice since then, always finding it exactly as I left it, empty, abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But sometimes, when I'm checking cameras in other parts of the wilderness, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if my equipment is being watched by someone who understands the forest better than I do. The migration stopped after I retrieved all the cameras from the abandoned site. Whatever had been moving them seemed satisfied once they'd completed their documentation of that old campsite. I've never had equipment relocate itself since then, but I still wonder about David Chen, the graduate student who walked away from his research 32 years ago and left everything behind. Sometimes I wonder if he ever really left that mountainside, or if he's still out there somewhere, making sure his campsite doesn't get forgotten completely. The forest keeps its own records, in ways we don't always understand. I'm Maria Santos. I've been a conservation officer with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission for 11 years now, working everything from poaching investigations to search and rescue operations in the Everglades. I've seen people do irrational things in the wilderness, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered at Big Cypress in the summer of 2023. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in mid-July. A birding group had reported seeing the same photographer in Miller's Meadow for 4 consecutive days, sitting in the exact same position from sunrise to sunset. They'd tried to approach him on the 2nd day, but he'd waved them off without speaking. By the 4th day, they were concerned enough to contact our office. Miller's Meadow is a remote spot in Big Cypress National Preserve, accessible only by a 3-mile hike through saw palmetto and cypress swamp. It's a beautiful location, especially in early morning when the light filters through the canopy and illuminates the marsh grasses. Popular with photographers and birders, but isolated enough that you might not see another person for days. I figured it was probably someone on a legitimate photo assignment who didn't want to be disturbed. Happens more often than you'd think. Wildlife photographers can be obsessive about their work, especially when they're trying to document specific animal behavior or capture particular lighting conditions. But 4 days in the same spot was unusual, even for dedicated professionals. I hiked out there on Thursday morning, taking the main trail that winds through the cypress stands and opens up into the meadow from the east. The weather was typical for July in South Florida, hot, humid, with afternoon thunderstorms building on the horizon. The meadow itself is about 2 acres of open grassland, surrounded by cypress and live oak, with a seasonal marsh that fills during the rainy season. Perfect habitat for wading birds, alligators, and the occasional black bear. I could see why a photographer would be drawn to the location. I spotted the setup immediately. About 50 yards from the tree line, someone had positioned a camp chair and professional camera equipment facing the marsh. Long telephoto lens, expensive tripod, what looked like a portable blind to minimize human visibility. The kind of setup that cost serious money and suggested someone who knew what they were doing, but I didn't see any photographer. I called out as I approached, standard procedure when you encounter someone in the field. Conservation officer, checking on a welfare report. No response. The chair was positioned so that whoever had been sitting in it would have their back to my approach. But I could see the equipment was still active. The camera was powered on. The lens cap was off. Everything ready for immediate use. That's when I noticed the camp chair was still warm, not hot from sun exposure. The area was partially shaded by surrounding trees. Warm like someone had been sitting in it recently and had just gotten up. I touched the fabric carefully, and it retained body heat, the way a chair does when you've been sitting in it for hours and step away for just a few minutes. I circled around to face the setup, and that's when I found the footprints. A clear trail led from the photographer's position directly toward the marsh, about 30 yards away. Adult footprints, hiking boots, pressed deep into the soft ground like someone walking with purpose rather than wandering casually. The prints were fresh, probably made within the last hour, based on the moisture content and edge definition. They led straight into the water and disappeared. The marsh at that point is deceptive. Looks shallow from a distance, maybe knee-deep, with emergent vegetation and scattered cypress knees that would make for easy footing. But I knew from previous surveys that it drops off quickly toward the center, reaching depths of 10 or 12 feet in some spots. More importantly, the bottom is soft muck that can trap someone if they're not careful. I followed the footprints to the water's edge and tried to see where they continued, but the murky water and floating vegetation made it impossible to track the trail any further. The last clear print was at the waterline, pointing directly toward the deeper sections of the marsh. I radioed for backup and started documenting everything while I waited. The camera equipment was high-end, easily worth several $1,000s. Memory cards were still in the cameras. Batteries showed full charge. Everything functioning normally. A small cooler contained water bottles and energy bars. Enough supplies for someone planning to spend a full day in the field. What struck me as odd was how organized everything was. The photographer's gear was arranged with military precision, extra batteries lined up by size, lens cloths folded and stored properly, even a small notebook with weather observations and timestamps going back 4 days. The entries were methodical, almost obsessive. 6:15 a.m., overcast, light wind from southeast, great blue heron, active near center marsh. 10:30 a.m., sun breaking through. Excellent backlighting opportunities. 2:45 p.m., thunderheads building, may need to pack early. But the final entry, made that morning, was different. Subject approaching, time to proceed. I read that line several times, trying to understand what it meant. Subject approaching was the photographer documenting human activity? Had someone been scheduled to meet them in this remote location? And proceed where? Into the marsh? When backup arrived, we initiated a water search protocol. 2 officers, with probing poles, working systematically from the shore toward the deeper sections. The marsh bottom was exactly as treacherous as I'd expected, soft, organic muck that could easily trap someone who stepped wrong or became disoriented. We found nothing. No body, no additional equipment, no signs that anyone had passed through the water beyond those footprints leading in from shore. After 3 hours of methodical searching, we called in the dive team from County Rescue. Professional divers spent the rest of the day working the deeper sections of the marsh. The visibility was nearly zero, and the bottom conditions made for slow, dangerous work. They found fallen logs, discarded fishing gear, even an old airboat motor that had been dumped years earlier. But no photographer. We expanded the search over the next 2 days, bringing in additional personnel and a helicopter for aerial reconnaissance. Checked every possible exit route from the marsh, interviewed other visitors to the area, even brought in tracking dogs to see if they could pick up a scent trail. The dogs were interesting. They confirmed the human scent leading from the photographer's position to the water's edge. But they also alerted on something else. About 20 yards north of the camera setup, they detected what their handler described as a distress scent, the chemical signature of fear or extreme stress. But there were no footprints or other physical evidence in that location. Just the dogs reacting to something we couldn't see or measure. The case stayed active for 2 weeks before being transferred to the sheriff's office as a missing person investigation. They processed the camera equipment for fingerprints, analyzed the photographs on the memory cards, even brought in specialists to examine the notebook handwriting for signs of psychological distress. The photos were exactly what you'd expect from a wildlife photographer. Hundreds of images of birds, alligators, vegetation, atmospheric shots of the marsh at different times of day. Professional quality work, technically excellent, showing someone with real skill and patience. But buried in the chronological sequence, I found something that bothered me. Starting on the second day, scattered among the wildlife photos, were images of the tree line behind the photographer's position. Not artistic compositions or establishing shots, but quick, almost furtive photographs of the forest edge, as if the photographer had been turning around periodically to document something approaching from behind. The final series of photos, taken on the morning of the disappearance, showed movement in the trees. Barely visible, just shadows and shifting vegetation, but definitely something large moving through the forest toward the meadow. The timestamps on these photos ran up until about 30 minutes before I arrived at the scene. The last image showed a clear view of the marsh, with what looked like ripples spreading across the water surface near the center. Officially, the case remains open but inactive. No body was ever recovered. No additional evidence was found, and no family members ever came forward to report the photographer missing. The equipment was eventually processed as abandoned property and donated to a local college photography program. But I still think about that warm camp chair and those deliberate footprints leading into the water. What I can't understand is the timing. If someone had been sitting in that chair for hours, as suggested by the body heat, where were they when I arrived? The footprints led directly into the marsh, but our search found no trace of anyone in the water. More troubling were those final photographs showing movement in the trees. Was someone else in the meadow that morning, approaching the photographer from behind? And if so, what happened when they reached the camera position? I've been back to Miller's Meadow 6 times since then, always finding reasons to patrol that area during my regular rounds. The meadow looks exactly the same, peaceful, beautiful. The kind of place where you could spend hours just watching the wildlife and enjoying the solitude. But sometimes, when I'm sitting where that photographer's chair was positioned, I find myself turning around to check the tree line behind me, wondering if someone might be approaching through the shadows, moving with the same purposeful steps that left those prints leading into the marsh. The wilderness keeps its secrets, and some people choose to become part of those secrets rather than explain them. But I still wonder about that photographer, sitting patiently in the same spot for 4 days, documenting something that was approaching from behind. And I wonder what they saw in those final moments that made them walk so deliberately into water that would leave no trace of where they'd gone. I'm Tom Bradley. I've worked for the Forest Service in the Route National Forest for 14 years now, mostly doing wildlife surveys and managing our photo permit program. It's steady work processing applications, checking credentials, making sure photographers follow regulations in sensitive areas. Nothing too complicated, which suits me fine. At least, it did until the fall of 2023. The whole thing started with a routine permit renewal. We require professional photographers to submit samples of their work when they apply for extended access permits, partly for quality control, and partly to make sure they're documenting wildlife behavior responsibly. I was processing applications for the October permit cycle when I noticed something odd about 2 separate submissions. Both photographers had included shots of the same elk herd taken during the rutting season. Not unusual in itself, elk behavior during the rut is popular subject matter, and we get dozens of photographers every year trying to capture the same general scenes. But these weren't just similar shots, they were identical. Same elk, same positions, same lighting, same background vegetation. The animals were captured in mid-movement, with individual elk in poses that would have lasted maybe a second or two at most. One bull had his head thrown back mid-bugle. Cows were in various stages of grazing or alert postures. Calves positioned exactly the same relative to their mothers. At first, I figured one photographer had copied the other's work, maybe found the image online and submitted it as their own. Happens more than you'd think, especially with competitive permit processes where people are trying to demonstrate their skills. But when I checked the metadata, things got complicated. Both images had identical timestamps. September 22nd, 2023, at 11:47 a.m. and 33 seconds. Same camera settings, same GPS coordinates embedded in the files. Well, not exactly the same coordinates. The GPS data showed the photos were taken from positions 12 miles apart. I pulled out my topographic maps and plotted both locations. The first image came from Sarah Chen, a wildlife photographer from Denver, who'd requested access to the Yampa River Valley. Her GPS coordinates put her on a ridge overlooking a meadow system about 8 miles north of Steamboat Springs. The second image was submitted by Marcus Webb, a freelance photographer from Boulder. His GPS data placed him on a completely different ridge, 12 miles southeast of Chen's position, overlooking a separate drainage system. Both photographers claimed to have been alone when they took their shots. Both swore they'd never encountered another photographer in the field that day, and both had captured the exact same moment in time, down to the second, of the same elk herd. I spent 2 days trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe one photographer had somehow faked their GPS data. Maybe the timestamps were wrong. Maybe it was some kind of digital manipulation I wasn't sophisticated enough to detect. But the more I examined the files, the less sense any of those explanations made. I decided to contact both photographers directly. Started with Sarah Chen. Called her on a Thursday afternoon. Ms. Chen, this is Tom Bradley with the Forest Service. I'm reviewing your permit application, and I have some questions about one of your elk photographs. She was cooperative, professional, described her day in detail, hiking before dawn to reach her position, waiting for hours for the elk to move into good lighting, getting lucky with that particular shot during peak rutting activity. I've never gotten such a perfect capture of that specific moment, she told me. The bull was bugling, and the whole herd was in motion. It was maybe a 2-second window at most. I asked about other photographers in the area that day. She was certain she'd been alone, had seen some elk hunters in the distance earlier in the morning, but no other photographers. She'd specifically chosen that location because it was remote and less likely to have human traffic. The conversation with Marcus Webb was almost identical. Same story, same details, same insistence that he'd been alone. He described the exact same 2-second window, the same perfect lighting, the same sense of getting incredibly lucky with timing, but he'd been 12 miles away from Chen's position. I asked both photographers to send me additional shots from that day, hoping to find some explanation in the broader context. Both complied immediately, providing dozens of images from their respective locations. That's when the situation got more disturbing. Chen's additional photos clearly showed her shooting from a high ridge overlooking a meadow system I recognized from previous surveys. Classic elk habitat, with scattered aspen groves and open grassland. The lighting and terrain in her images matched the GPS coordinates perfectly. Webb's photos showed a completely different landscape. Dense forest, a narrow valley, steeper terrain. His images also matched his GPS data exactly. 2 different locations, 2 different ecosystems, 12 miles apart. But scattered throughout both photographers' image sequences were additional shots of the same elk herd, taken at different times throughout the morning. The elk appeared in various locations and poses, but always the same animals. The distinctive markings on the lead bull, the specific composition of cows and calves, even individual elk, with notable scars or coloration patterns. The elk herd had somehow been in two places at once, 12 miles apart, for the entire morning. I brought the situation to my supervisor, thinking maybe I was missing something obvious. She reviewed all the files, brought in a GIS specialist to verify the GPS data, even had someone from our IT department examine the photos for signs of digital manipulation. Everything checked out. The GPS coordinates were accurate, the timestamps were genuine, and the photos showed no signs of editing or fabrication. According to every technical analysis we could perform, two photographers had simultaneously documented the same elk herd from positions that were geographically impossible. My supervisor suggested we contact both photographers again, this time asking them to meet with us in person. Maybe there was some detail they'd forgotten, some explanation that would emerge through more detailed questioning. Sarah Chen drove up from Denver on a Tuesday, seemed genuinely puzzled by our questions, but remained cooperative. She walked us through her entire day, minute by minute, and her story never changed. She'd hiked alone to an isolated ridge, waited for hours, captured those elk photos during a brief window of perfect activity. When we showed her Marcus Webb's images, her reaction was immediate and visceral. She went pale, then asked to see the files again. "This is impossible," she said quietly. "These are my elk. I spent 3 days scouting this particular herd, learning their movement patterns. I could identify individual animals. But this," she gestured at Webb's photos, "this location doesn't exist anywhere near where I saw these elk." Marcus Webb had a similar reaction when he drove up from Boulder the following week. Recognized the elk immediately, insisted they were the same animals he'd been tracking for days. But he was equally certain about his location and equally baffled by the geographical impossibility. We arranged for both photographers to revisit their shooting locations, this time accompanied by Forest Service personnel. I hiked with Sarah Chen to her ridge position, while my supervisor accompanied Marcus Webb to his location. Both sites were exactly as described. Chen's ridge overlooked the meadow system shown in her photographs. Webb's position matched his images of the forested valley. 12 miles apart, completely different terrain, no possible line of sight between the two locations. But here's what really bothered me. When we reached Chen's shooting position, we found evidence that elk had been present recently. Fresh tracks, browsing sign, areas where the grass had been disturbed by large animals, all consistent with a herd spending time in that meadow system. At Webb's location, we found the same thing. Recent elk sign, clearly indicating the presence of a significant herd within the past few weeks. The elk had been in both places. We never did solve the mystery. Both photographers eventually received their permits, and both continued to work in our forest. I process their applications every year, and their work remains consistently professional and unremarkable. But I kept copies of those synchronized photographs, and sometimes I study them when I'm trying to understand what I witnessed that fall. The technical evidence is undeniable. Two photographers, 12 miles apart, captured identical images of the same elk herd at the exact same moment in time. The GPS data is accurate, the timestamps are genuine, and the photos show no signs of manipulation. Yet it's physically impossible. Elk don't teleport between locations. They follow predictable movement patterns, travel at known speeds, and exist in only one place at any given time. A herd can't be simultaneously present in two locations 12 miles apart, especially in terrain that would require days of travel to traverse. But according to every piece of evidence we collected, that's exactly what happened. What bothers me most is how normal both photographers seemed. No indication of psychological distress, no history of fabricating evidence, no motive for elaborate deception. They both described their experiences with the calm professionalism of people who spend their careers documenting wildlife behavior. And they both insisted, with absolute certainty, that they'd been alone when they captured those impossible images. I've been back to both locations multiple times since then, always hoping to find some explanation I'd missed. Some geographical feature that might explain how the same elk could appear in two distant locations. Some technical glitch that could account for the synchronized timestamps. I never found anything. The wilderness keeps its own logic, and sometimes that logic operates according to rules we don't understand. But I still wonder about those elk, and I still wonder what kind of world we're living in, where the same moment can happen in two places at once. The photographs are locked in my desk drawer, but I don't need to look at them to remember what they show. Sometimes I think about Sarah Chen and Marcus Webb, both sitting alone on distant ridges, both capturing the same impossible moment, both certain they were witnessing something unique and unrepeatable. Maybe they were right about the uniqueness. Maybe that's what makes it so disturbing. I'm Alice Chen. I've been a ranger in Olympic National Park for 9 years now, working primarily the backcountry sections where most visitors never venture. It's solitary work trail maintenance, wildlife monitoring, search and rescue when needed. I prefer it that way. The deep wilderness has its own rhythm, and I've learned to read it over the years. But nothing prepared me for what I started finding along the remote trails in the spring of 2023. It began with a telephoto lens. I was doing routine maintenance on the Quinault Ridge Trail, about 15 miles from the nearest trailhead, when I spotted something metallic reflecting sunlight from the underbrush. At first, I thought it might be litter. Hikers sometimes drop gear without realizing it, and expensive items have a way of catching the light. But when I pushed through the salmonberry bushes to investigate, I found a pristine Canon telephoto lens, easily worth $3,000, sitting upright on a flat rock, like someone had carefully placed it there. The lens was clean. Not just clean, but spotless. No dust, no water damage, no signs of weather exposure, despite being in one of the wettest ecosystems in North America. The lens cap was properly secured. The protective filters were in place, and when I checked the focus ring, it moved smoothly, without any grit or moisture interference. I documented the find with photographs and GPS coordinates, then hiked the lens back to the ranger station. Standard procedure for valuable lost property. We'd post notices at trailheads and check with recent permit holders to see if anyone was missing equipment. But when I ran the serial number through our database, I found something disturbing. The lens belonged to Michael Torres, a wildlife photographer who'd been reported missing 14 months earlier. Torres had been conducting a solo photography expedition in the park's backcountry when he failed to return to his pickup truck at the scheduled time. Search teams had covered hundreds of square miles over 3 weeks, finding no trace of him or his equipment. The case had been closed as a probable wilderness accident, with the assumption that Torres had suffered some kind of mishap in remote terrain, and his body simply hadn't been recovered. Happens more often than people realize, in country this wild and extensive, but here was his lens, sitting clean and functional on a rock 15 miles from where he'd last been seen. I reported the find to my supervisor, who contacted the county sheriff's office that had handled the original missing person case. They reopened the investigation, brought in additional search teams, and spent a week combing the area where I'd found the lens. They found nothing else. No other equipment, no human remains, no signs that Torres had ever been in that particular section of the park. 2 weeks later, I found a tripod. Same area, different trail. A professional carbon fiber tripod worth at least $2,000, set up properly beside the trail as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. The tripod was extended to full height. The head was level, and all the leg locks were properly secured. Like the lens, it was immaculate. No rust on the metal components, no wear on the rubber feet, no accumulation of moss or lichen that you'd expect after months of exposure to Olympic Peninsula weather. The serial number traced back to Jennifer Walsh, a nature photographer who disappeared in the park 2 years and 3 months earlier. Another solo expedition, another exhaustive search that found nothing, another case closed with no resolution. That's when I started paying closer attention during my backcountry patrols. Over the next 3 months, I found more equipment. Memory cards in waterproof cases, camera batteries still holding charge, lens filters arranged in neat stacks on fallen logs, every piece traced back to photographers who'd vanished in the park over the past 5 years. But the equipment wasn't randomly scattered. It appeared along specific trails, always in locations where it would be easily visible to anyone passing through. And it was always maintained in perfect condition, as if someone had been caring for it throughout its time in the wilderness. The memory cards were the most disturbing finds. Each card contained hundreds of photographs, clearly taken during the missing photographer's final expeditions. The images were chronologically organized, showing the progression of each person's journey into the backcountry. Wildlife shots, landscape photography, the kind of work you'd expect from serious professionals. But the final images on each card showed a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Every photographer had captured shots of the same locations: remote clearings, unusual rock formations, old-growth groves that weren't marked on any trail map. The photographs suggested these people had all been drawn to specific places deep in the wilderness, locations that weren't part of their original planned routes. More disturbing was the progression of images. The final photos on each memory card showed the photographer's equipment being systematically arranged and organized. Cameras mounted on tripods, lenses lined up by focal length, personal gear sorted and displayed, as if they were preparing for something. I brought all the evidence to my supervisor and requested permission to investigate the remote locations shown in the photographs. She was hesitant. The areas were extremely remote, requiring multi-day backpacking expeditions through challenging terrain. But the accumulating evidence suggested something was happening in our backcountry that needed investigation. I planned a 5-day solo expedition to reach the most frequently photographed location, a remote valley system about 25 miles from the nearest road. The site appeared in the final images from 4 different missing photographers, all showing the same clearing from slightly different angles. The hike took me 2 days through some of the most pristine wilderness in the park: old-growth cedar and spruce, pristine streams, terrain that felt untouched by human presence. The kind of country where you could understand how someone might choose to disappear completely. When I reached the clearing shown in the photographs, I found what remained of a camp. It wasn't recent. Tattered remnants of tents, corroded metal from pack frames, scattered pieces of equipment that had been weathered by years of exposure. But arranged around the perimeter of the clearing, mounted on makeshift stands carved from fallen branches, were cameras, dozens of cameras, all pointed toward the center of the clearing where the old camp had been. Professional wildlife photography equipment, different brands and models, some configurations I didn't recognize, all clean, all functional, all with fresh batteries and empty memory cards ready for use. I spent 3 hours documenting everything before I realized what I was looking at. It was a memorial. Someone had been collecting the equipment of missing photographers and arranging it in this remote location, creating a shrine or monument to people who'd vanished in the wilderness. The cameras were positioned as if they were still waiting for their owners to return and resume their work. But who had been maintaining this site? And how had they been keeping the equipment clean and functional in such a remote location? I checked the memory cards in several cameras and found recent images. Not wildlife photography, but shots of the memorial itself, taken from different angles and at different times of day. Someone had been visiting this location regularly, documenting the arrangement of equipment, adding new cameras as they became available. The timestamps on the images went back months, sometimes showing the memorial in different configurations as new equipment was added. But they never showed who was taking the photographs or maintaining the site. I hiked back to the ranger station and filed a comprehensive report, including GPS coordinates for the memorial site and detailed photographs of everything I'd found. My supervisor contacted federal authorities, who sent a team to investigate the location. They confirmed my findings, but couldn't identify who had created or maintained the memorial. The site was too remote for casual visitors, and there were no records of anyone having permits for extended stays in that area. The official investigation concluded that someone with extensive wilderness experience had been collecting equipment from missing persons cases and arranging it at this remote location. Possibly someone who'd known the missing photographers, or someone who felt a connection to people who disappeared in the wilderness. But they never identified the person responsible. What bothers me most is the maintenance. The equipment I found along the trails was always in perfect condition, despite months or years of exposure to one of the harshest environments in North America. Someone had been caring for those cameras and lenses, keeping them clean and functional, then placing them where they'd be found by other people. It suggests someone who understood the equipment, who knew how to maintain complex cameras and lenses in wilderness conditions. Someone with the skills and motivation to spend years preserving the tools of people who'd vanished without explanation. I've been back to the memorial site twice since my initial discovery. Each time, I've found new equipment arranged among the cameras, always items that trace back to missing photographers. The memorial continues to grow, tended by someone who remains invisible, but clearly dedicated to preserving the memory of people who chose to disappear into the wilderness. Sometimes, I wonder if the missing photographers really are missing, or if they've chosen to become part of something larger than individual identity. The wilderness has a way of calling to certain people, offering them something they can't find in the outside world. But I also wonder about the person maintaining that memorial, spending years collecting and preserving equipment in one of the most remote locations in North America. What drives someone to take on that responsibility? And what do they know about the photographers who vanished that the rest of us don't understand? The memorial is still there, still growing, still being maintained by someone who leaves no trace of their presence except clean cameras and carefully arranged equipment. I think about it every time I patrol the backcountry, wondering if I'll find more equipment along the trails, wondering if someday I might discover who's been caring for the memory of people who walked into the wilderness and chose not to return. I'm David Martinez. I've been a wildlife biologist with the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks for 13 years, mostly working grizzly bear research in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. It's technical work analyzing behavior patterns, processing GPS collar data, reviewing thousands of trail camera images. Methodical, scientific, the kind of job where anomalies usually have rational explanations. At least, that's what I believed until the winter of 2023. The case started with a routine search and rescue operation. Robert Kim, a wildlife photographer from Seattle, had been working on a project documenting winter wildlife behavior in the wilderness complex. He'd obtained all the proper permits, filed detailed itineraries, and was using a satellite emergency beacon for safety communication. On February 8th, Kim's beacon transmitted a routine check-in message from his planned campsite near Chinese Wall. 6 hours later, the beacon sent an automated distress signal indicating either equipment malfunction or emergency activation. After that, nothing. Search teams deployed immediately, but winter conditions in the Bob Marshall are brutal. Deep snow, sub-zero temperatures, weather that can turn deadly in minutes. The helicopter couldn't reach Kim's last known position for 3 days due to storms, and ground teams took even longer to cover the terrain. When they finally reached the beacon's GPS coordinates, they found Kim's campsite intact but abandoned. Tent still standing, sleeping bag laid out, camp stove with partially cooked food still in the pot. His snowshoes were gone, along with his camera equipment and day pack. But there were no tracks leading away from the site. The snow around the camp was undisturbed except for the landing zone where rescue teams had approached. They spent 2 weeks searching an expanding radius around Kim's campsite, bringing in additional resources, even using avalanche probe teams to check areas where someone might have been buried by snowfall. Nothing. No tracks, no equipment, no sign that Kim had ever left his campsite. The search was eventually called off due to weather and the low probability of survival in those conditions. Kim was declared missing and presumed dead. Another wilderness tragedy, where someone had been swallowed by country too vast and harsh for easy answers. 3 months later, a backcountry skier found Kim's camera equipment. The gear was discovered 15 miles from Kim's last campsite, sitting on a rocky outcrop that had been blown clear of snow. Professional camera body, telephoto lens, tripod, all arranged neatly, as if someone had set up for a photo session and then stepped away. The equipment was undamaged, protected from moisture by careful placement under a natural rock overhang. The local sheriff's office recovered the equipment and contacted our department because of Kim's wildlife photography permits. They wanted someone with technical expertise to review the camera's memory cards, hoping the images might provide clues about what had happened during Kim's final days. That's how the camera ended up on my desk. I started by organizing the images chronologically, standard procedure for analyzing field data. Kim had been a skilled photographer, and his final expedition had produced hundreds of high-quality images: winter wildlife, landscape shots, atmospheric photographs of snow and forest that showed real artistic talent. The chronological sequence told the story of his final week in the wilderness. Daily photography sessions, systematic documentation of animal tracks and feeding areas, the methodical work of someone conducting serious research rather than casual picture-taking. But as I worked through the final day's images, I noticed something troubling. The last several photos showed Kim's campsite from various angles, as if he'd been documenting his own setup rather than wildlife. Shots of his tent, his gear arrangement, even images of his emergency beacon sitting beside his sleeping area. The final dozen images were increasingly strange. Close-up shots of his own hands, his boots, even a self-portrait showing his face in harsh artificial light from his camera's flash. Not the kind of images you'd expect from a professional wildlife photographer. But the very last photograph in the sequence stopped me completely. It was a clear, well-composed image of Robert Kim's face, taken from directly behind his position. The photo showed Kim in profile, looking toward something outside the frame. His expression was alert, focused, as if he was observing wildlife or listening for sounds in the forest. The lighting was natural daylight, the focus was sharp, and the composition was technically perfect. But the angle was impossible. According to the image's perspective, the camera had been positioned behind Kim at about head height, maybe 3 feet away. The shot showed the back and side of his head, his winter jacket, even the strap of his day pack across his shoulder. Kim couldn't have taken this photograph himself. The angle was wrong, the distance was wrong, and there was no mechanism visible that could have triggered the camera remotely. I checked the metadata immediately. The timestamp showed the image was captured on February 8th at 4:27 p.m., 3 hours and 12 minutes after Kim's emergency beacon had stopped transmitting. I spent the rest of the day trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe Kim had rigged some kind of remote trigger system. Maybe the timestamp was wrong due to camera malfunction. Maybe someone else had been with him in the wilderness, though there was no record of additional permits or planned companions. None of those explanations held up under scrutiny. Kim's equipment inventory showed no remote triggers or wireless camera controls. The timestamp matched the camera's internal clock perfectly, which had been accurate throughout the entire photo sequence. And if someone else had taken the photograph, where were their tracks around Kim's campsite? I contacted the sheriff's office and requested a meeting with the lead investigator. Detective Sarah Mills had worked missing person cases for 15 years and was familiar with the strange things that happened in wilderness environments. "I've seen cameras malfunction in cold weather," she told me after reviewing the images. "Timestamps get scrambled, files get corrupted, weird things happen with digital equipment. But this," she gestured at the final photograph on my computer screen, "this is different." We brought in a digital forensic specialist to examine the camera and memory cards for signs of tampering or technical malfunction. After 3 days of analysis, his conclusion was unambiguous. The equipment was functioning normally, the timestamp was accurate, and the image showed no signs of digital manipulation. Robert Kim's camera had somehow photographed him from behind, 3 hours after his emergency beacon stopped working, in a location 15 miles from where the camera was eventually found. The detective reopened the investigation, but additional searching produced no new evidence. Kim's body was never recovered. No witness came forward with information about his final days, and no explanation emerged for how that final photograph had been captured. The case remains officially open but inactive. Kim's family received his camera equipment after the investigation concluded, though I kept copies of the digital files for our department's records. I've studied that final image hundreds of times over the past year, trying to understand what I'm looking at. The photograph is technically perfect, showing no signs of manipulation or equipment malfunction. Kim appears calm and alert, not distressed or injured. He's clearly alive and conscious when the image was taken. But who took the photograph? And how did Kim's camera end up 15 miles away from his campsite, arranged carefully on a rocky outcrop, as if someone wanted it to be found? What bothers me most is Kim's expression in that final image. He's looking towards something with complete attention, the way wildlife photographers do when they've spotted something significant. His posture suggests anticipation rather than fear, as if he was about to capture something remarkable. But there are no more photographs after that final, impossible shot. I've been back to both locations, Kim's original campsite and the outcrop where his camera was found. The terrain between them is extremely challenging, requiring technical mountaineering skills and several days of travel even in good conditions. Not the kind of journey someone would make in winter without leaving extensive evidence of their passage. Yet somehow, Kim's camera made that journey and was carefully positioned where it would eventually be discovered by other backcountry travelers. Sometimes I wonder if Kim himself arranged for the camera to be found, if he's still out there in the wilderness for reasons we can't understand. The final photograph suggests someone who was fully present and engaged with his environment, not someone in distress or facing immediate danger. But that raises questions I'm not equipped to answer about why someone would choose to disappear so completely, leaving behind only an impossible photograph as evidence of their final moment. The wilderness keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets involve people who decide to become part of the mystery rather than solve it. But I still wonder about Robert Kim, and I still wonder who was behind that camera when the final frame was captured. The image sits in my files, technically perfect and logically impossible. A reminder that some questions don't have answers that fit within our understanding of how the world works. I'm Karen Wright. I've been a park supervisor at Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 16 years, overseeing operations across some of the most remote sections of the park. It's administrative work, mostly coordinating search and rescue, managing permits, analyzing incident reports, the kind of job where patterns emerge slowly, where you need years of data to see connections that aren't immediately obvious. Which is exactly how I discovered what I now call the rotational pattern at Cove Mountain Overlook. The overlook itself isn't particularly remarkable. A rocky outcrop about 4 miles from the nearest parking area, accessible only by a moderately difficult hiking trail that winds through old-growth forest. It offers a decent view of Hazel Creek Valley, popular with photographers who want shots of the layered ridges and seasonal foliage changes. What made it remarkable was the disappearances. I first noticed the pattern in late 2022 when I was reviewing missing person statistics for our annual safety report. 5 photographers had vanished from parkland over the previous 7 years. All solo expeditions, all declared missing after failing to return from planned overnight trips. Individual disappearances aren't unusual in a park that covers over 500,000 acres of wilderness. People get lost, suffer accidents, sometimes make poor decisions that lead to tragedy. But when I plotted the last known locations of these 5 photographers, they formed a cluster around Cove Mountain Overlook that was statistically impossible to ignore. More strange was the timing. The disappearances occurred at regular intervals roughly 16 months apart, always during different seasons, but following a consistent pattern across the 7-year span. I pulled the individual case files and spent a week reviewing everything: search reports, evidence logs, witness statements, personal effects recovered from campsites, Each case had been thoroughly investigated and eventually closed when no additional evidence emerged. But reading them together revealed details that hadn't been connected across the separate investigations. All 5 photographers had been working on long-term projects documenting seasonal changes in the park. All had obtained extended permits for multiple visits to the same general area, and all had left behind journals with increasingly erratic entries leading up to their disappearances. The first case was Michael Chen, who vanished in March of 2016. Chen had been photographing early spring conditions around Hazel Creek Valley, focusing on the transition from winter dormancy to new growth. His journal entries started normally technical notes about lighting, weather observations, equipment settings, but his final week of entries showed a marked change in tone. Chen wrote repeatedly about movement in the valley that doesn't match wind patterns, and something that appears briefly in long exposures but not in real-time observation. His handwriting became increasingly hurried, and his final entry was barely legible. Tomorrow I'll use the telephoto from the overlook. Whatever's down there, I'm going to document it properly. Lisa Rodriguez disappeared in July of 2017, 17 months after Chen. A nature photographer specializing in summer wildlife behavior, Rodriguez had been documenting nocturnal animal activity using infrared equipment. Her journal showed the same progression from professional observations to obsessive focus on unexplained phenomena. "Something moves through the valley at night," she wrote, in an entry dated 3 days before her disappearance. "Too large for deer. Wrong movement pattern for bear. Camera keeps triggering but images show nothing definitive. Need better position for observation." Her final entries deteriorated into fragmented phrases and sketchy diagrams that resembled movement patterns or tracking charts. The last legible line read, "From the overlook at dawn, can see the whole pattern." The pattern continued through 3 more cases. James Morrison in November of 2018, describing systematic movement that follows no natural animal behavior. Sarah Kim in March of 2020, writing about coordinated activity that suggests intelligence but not human presence. Most recently, David Park in July of 2021, whose journal contained detailed observations about recurring phenomena that peak during seasonal transitions. Each photographer had been drawn to Cove Mountain Overlook as their final documented location. Each had left equipment and personal belongings at campsites, suggesting they'd planned to return, and each had left journals with final entries that became progressively less coherent, as if their ability to communicate clearly had deteriorated along with their mental state. After reviewing all 5 cases, I decided to visit the overlook myself. The hike took me 3 hours through typical Smoky Mountain terrain, steep grades, dense forest, humidity that soaks through clothing even in winter. The overlook itself is a granite shelf that extends about 20 feet from the tree line, offering an unobstructed view of Hazel Creek Valley stretching toward the horizon. It's a beautiful spot, the kind of location that would naturally attract photographers. Morning light illuminates the layered ridges dramatically, and seasonal changes in vegetation create constantly shifting color patterns across the landscape. But standing on that rocky outcrop, looking down into the valley, I felt an immediate sense of unease. The valley seemed too still. No visible wildlife movement, no birds disturbing the canopy, no obvious signs of the active ecosystem you'd expect in healthy mountain habitat. Just layer upon layer of forested ridges extending into hazy distance, silent and seemingly empty. I spent 2 hours at the overlook, using binoculars to scan the valley systematically. The terrain was typical for the region: mixed hardwood forest, seasonal streams, rocky outcrops where deer or bear might travel between feeding areas. Nothing unusual or noteworthy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something obvious. I returned to the overlook 4 more times over the next 6 months, always during different seasons and different times of day. Spring morning, when mist rose from the valley floor. Summer afternoon, when the light was harsh and direct. Fall evening, when the foliage created complex shadow patterns. Winter dawn, when snow highlighted terrain features normally hidden by vegetation. During my third visit, I brought a telephoto lens and spent the day photographing the valley from the same positions the missing photographers would have used. The images were technically competent but unremarkable standard landscape photography showing typical mountain scenery. But when I reviewed the images later, I noticed something I'd missed during real-time observation. In several photographs, taken at different times throughout the day, there were subtle variations in shadow patterns that didn't correspond to the movement of sun or clouds. Small areas where the forest canopy seemed denser or lighter than in adjacent frames, as if something large was moving beneath the tree cover. The variations were barely perceptible, visible only when comparing multiple images from the same vantage point. But they suggested systematic movement through the valley, not random animal activity, but purposeful travel along consistent routes. I brought the images to our wildlife biologist for analysis. She confirmed that the shadow variations were real, but couldn't identify any known animal behavior that would create such patterns. The movement covered too much territory, too quickly for individual animals, yet showed too much coordination for random herd activity. Whatever's moving down there, she told me, it's either very large or very numerous, possibly both. I reported my findings to the park superintendent and requested permission to establish a monitoring station at the overlook. She approved a limited research project, allowing me to install motion-activated cameras and conduct systematic observation of the valley. Over the next 3 months, I collected hundreds of hours of footage and thousands of still images. The cameras documented normal wildlife activity, deer, bears, smaller mammals moving through their typical ranges. But they also captured the same shadow variations I'd noticed in my telephoto shots. Something was moving through Hazel Creek Valley on a regular basis, creating patterns of displacement in the forest canopy that were visible from the overlook but never clearly resolved into identifiable shapes or creatures. More disturbing was what happened to the equipment itself. Cameras would function normally for weeks, then suddenly start malfunctioning in consistent ways. Memory cards would fill with hundreds of images from the same timestamp, all showing identical frames, as if the camera had been triggered repeatedly in rapid succession. Battery life would drain impossibly quickly, sometimes going from full charge to dead within hours. And occasionally, I'd find cameras repositioned on their mounts, angled toward different sections of the valley, as if someone had been adjusting their field of view. The monitoring project was suspended after equipment losses exceeded our budget for replacement. Officially, the malfunctions were attributed to environmental factors and wildlife interference. But I kept copies of all the data we'd collected, and I continued to review the images, trying to understand what those 5 photographers had been observing from the overlook. Each of them had been drawn to document something moving in Hazel Creek Valley. Each had become increasingly obsessed with phenomena they couldn't clearly capture or explain, and each had eventually vanished while attempting to get definitive documentation from Cove Mountain Overlook. I've been back to the Overlook 6 times since the monitoring project ended, always alone, always carrying minimal equipment. The view remains beautiful and disturbing in equal measure. The valley still seems too quiet, too empty, despite clear evidence that something large and coordinated continues to move through the forest below. Sometimes I understand why those photographers became so focused on documenting what they were seeing. There's something down there that demands attention, something that draws the eye and refuses to resolve into clear understanding. The urge to capture definitive proof becomes overwhelming when you spend enough time watching. But I also understand why their journal entries became illegible toward the end. Some phenomena resist documentation, and the effort to force clarity from ambiguity can break down the normal processes of observation and communication. The rotational pattern continues. It's been 2 years since David Park disappeared, which means we're approaching the timeline when another photographer might be drawn to Cove Mountain Overlook. I monitor permit applications carefully now, watching for the profile of solo photographers planning extended stays in that area. I haven't found any yet, but I know it's just a matter of time before someone else notices what moves in Hazel Creek Valley. and decides they need to document it properly. When that happens, I'll probably try to discourage them, though I'm not sure how effective warnings would be against the kind of obsession that drives people to stand on that overlook and stare into a valley that stares back. I'm Ray Thompson. I've been doing trail maintenance for Shenandoah National Park for 11 years now, working the backcountry sections where most visitors never venture. It's honest work clearing blowdown, maintaining bridges, keeping the remote trails passable for the occasional backpacker or researcher. You see a lot of things when you work alone in the woods, but nothing prepared me for what I started finding in the abandoned campsites during the spring of 2023. The park has dozens of old campsites scattered through the wilderness areas, most of them unofficial spots where people have been camping for decades before modern regulations kicked in. Some are still maintained, others have been officially closed, and a few just get forgotten over time. Part of my job is checking these sites periodically, cleaning up litter, documenting any damage or unauthorized use. It was routine work until I started finding the photographs. The first batch showed up at a campsite near Dark Hollow Falls, about 6 miles from the nearest parking area. Someone had been camping there recently. Fire ring with cold ashes, compacted soil where a tent had been pitched. The usual signs of temporary occupation. But scattered around the site were maybe 40 or 50 printed photographs, all left behind like trash. At first, I figured someone had accidentally dropped their vacation photos. Happens more than you'd think. People get careless with personal items when they're packing up camp in a hurry. I gathered them up to turn in at the visitor center, standard procedure for found property. But when I looked at the images more closely, I realized they were all identical. Every single photograph showed the same scene: a white-tailed deer standing in a small clearing, photographed from the same angle and distance. Same deer, same pose, same lighting, same background vegetation. Not similar shots from a burst mode sequence, but literally identical images. As if someone had made 50 copies of the same photograph. The prints were professional quality, printed on expensive photo paper, with sharp detail and accurate color reproduction. Someone had invested serious money in producing multiple copies of this single deer image. I turned them in to my supervisor, who filed them as abandoned property and forgot about them. Standard procedure for items that couldn't be traced to specific owners. 3 weeks later, I found more photographs at a different campsite. This time, it was near Limberlost Trail, about 8 miles from the first location. Another abandoned campsite. Another collection of printed photographs scattered around the fire ring. Maybe 60 or 70 prints this time, all showing the exact same deer image I'd found at Dark Hollow Falls. Same deer, same angle, same clearing. Identical in every detail, down to individual leaves in the background and the specific pattern of light and shadow across the animal's coat. I collected this batch too, but now I was paying closer attention. The prints showed slight variations in color balance and paper quality, suggesting they'd been produced by different printers or processing labs. But the image itself was always identical. My supervisor was less dismissive this time. We contacted the park's wildlife biologist to see if there might be some research project involved, some legitimate reason why someone would be distributing multiple copies of the same deer photograph. She had no knowledge of any such project. No permits had been issued for wildlife photography research that would involve printing and distributing images. No university studies, no government surveys, nothing that would explain what we were finding. Over the next 2 months, I found photographs at 7 more campsites scattered across different sections of the park. Always the same image, always multiple copies, always left behind at sites that showed recent but temporary occupation. The quantities kept increasing. First 40 prints, then 60, then over 100 at a site near Stony Man Summit. Each collection was abandoned at a different campsite, sometimes separated by 20 miles of hiking trails and rugged terrain. By June, I'd collected over 800 copies of the same deer photograph. That's when my supervisor decided to involve park law enforcement. Ranger Martinez took the investigation seriously, treating it as potential evidence of coordinated illegal activity. Someone was systematically camping at remote sites throughout the park and leaving behind hundreds of identical photographs. Martinez organized the prints by location and date found, looking for patterns that might indicate who was responsible. The campsites showed no signs of permanent habitation, no cached supplies, no modified vegetation, no infrastructure that would suggest long-term use. But someone was clearly visiting these locations regularly, staying long enough to use them as base camps, then moving on. The really disturbing discovery came when Martinez had the photographs analyzed by digital forensics specialists. The prints had been produced by at least 15 different printers and processing labs, based on paper composition and printing characteristics. The images showed identical metadata when scanned, indicating they all originated from the same digital file, but they'd been printed at different times over a period of several months, using equipment from locations across multiple states. Someone had been distributing the same digital image to photographers or printing services throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, having hundreds of copies produced, then transporting them to remote campsites in Shenandoah National Park. Martinez expanded the investigation, contacting other parks in the region to see if they'd encountered similar phenomena. Within a week, we had reports from Blue Ridge Parkway, Great Smoky Mountains, and Mammoth Cave. All described finding identical deer photographs at abandoned campsites, always in large quantities, always the same image. The scope of the operation was staggering. Thousands of prints distributed across hundreds of miles of wilderness, all showing the same deer, in the same pose, from the same angle. But nobody could identify the original photographer or explain why someone would invest so much time and money in mass-producing and distributing a single wildlife image. Martinez brought in additional resources, including specialists from the FBI's Environmental Crimes Unit. They analyzed the photographs using every available technique, chemical composition of the paper, trace elements in the inks, even microscopic analysis of individual pixels in the digital scans. What they found was even more puzzling. The prints had been produced using equipment from dozens of different photography studios, camera shops, and commercial printing services across 8 states. The orders had been placed by different people using different payment methods, but all requesting the same image file. Investigation of the print shops revealed that customers had been providing the image on various storage media memory cards, USB drives, even email attachments. The shop owners remembered the orders because of their unusual nature. Large quantities of identical prints with no apparent commercial or personal purpose. But none of the customers could be traced. They'd paid cash, provided false contact information, or used prepaid cards that couldn't be tracked to specific individuals. The investigation stalled when forensic analysis of the original image revealed something impossible. According to metadata analysis, the photograph had been taken by at least 40 different cameras over a span of 3 years. Same image, same composition, same lighting and timing, but captured using different equipment by different photographers who had no apparent connection to each other. The technical evidence suggested that dozens of people had independently photographed the same deer in the same location at the same moment, using different cameras and different settings, yet somehow producing identical results. The FBI closed their investigation after 6 months, classifying the case as unusual but not criminal. No laws had been broken, no environmental damage had occurred, and no individuals had been harmed. The mass distribution of photographs was odd, but not illegal. But I kept finding more prints. Even after the investigation ended, I continued discovering identical deer photographs at abandoned campsites throughout my work area. Smaller quantities now, usually 20 or 30 prints rather than hundreds, but always the same image scattered around cold fire rings and empty tent sites. I stopped reporting them after the first few discoveries. My supervisor had made it clear that unless new evidence emerged, the Park Service wasn't going to invest more resources in what had become a cold case. But I kept collecting the photographs, storing them in boxes in my garage, trying to understand what I was witnessing. What bothers me most is the coordination involved. Someone, or some group, had organized the production and distribution of thousands of identical photographs across multiple states and dozens of wilderness areas. The logistics alone would require significant planning and resources. Yet there was no apparent purpose to the operation. No message embedded in the image. No commercial benefit. No political or environmental statement. Just the same deer photograph, reproduced endlessly and left behind at remote campsites like some kind of calling card. I've been back to every site where I found the prints, sometimes multiple times, hoping to encounter whoever was responsible. The campsites continue to show periodic use, but I've never seen anyone during my visits. Whoever is doing this knows the park well enough to avoid detection while carrying out a complex distribution operation. Sometimes I wonder if the deer in the photograph is real, or if it represents something else entirely. A symbol, a marker, a way for certain people to identify each other across vast distances and wilderness areas. But mostly, I wonder about the photographers who captured that image, using dozens of different cameras. Were they working together? Did they know about each other? And what brought them all to the same place, at the same moment, to photograph the same deer, from the same impossible angle? The boxes of photographs are still in my garage. Thousands of identical images of a deer that may or may not exist, in a clearing that may or may not be real. I've stopped trying to solve the mystery, but I haven't stopped thinking about it. Some phenomena in the wilderness don't have explanations that fit our normal understanding of how people behave. But I still check those abandoned campsites during my maintenance rounds, and I still find occasional batches of photographs, always the same deer, always the same angle, always left behind by people who remain as invisible as the purpose they're serving. I'm Lisa Rodriguez. I've been coordinating search and rescue operations for Zion National Park for 12 years now, working everything from routine extractions to complex multi-day searches in the backcountry. It's technical work that relies on data analysis, GPS tracking, and systematic approaches to finding people in terrain that can hide someone completely. I've seen search patterns that didn't make sense, but nothing prepared me for what I discovered when we tracked Nathan Pierce's movements in October of 2023. Pierce was a landscape photographer from Portland who'd obtained permits for a solo backpacking trip in the Kolob Canyon section of the park. Experienced hiker, proper equipment, detailed itinerary filed with our office. The kind of visitor who follows protocols and knows how to take care of himself in remote terrain. His emergency beacon activated on October 14th at 3:47 in the afternoon, transmitting GPS coordinates from a location about 8 miles into the backcountry. Standard protocol requires immediate response to beacon activations, so we deployed a helicopter within an hour to reach his position. But when the flight crew reached the coordinates, they found nothing. No person, no equipment, no signs of distress or accident. Just empty desert landscape with no indication that anyone had been there recently. The beacon had gone silent by the time we reached the location, showing no active signal and no additional emergency transmissions. We expanded the search pattern, bringing in ground teams to cover the area systematically, but found no trace of Pierce or his equipment. What made the case unusual was the GPS data from Pierce's personal device. Most experienced hikers carry GPS units or satellite communicators that log their movements automatically, creating detailed track records of their journeys. Pierce had been using a professional-grade GPS unit that recorded his position every 60 seconds throughout his trip. When we downloaded the data from his device, which we found attached to his backpack at the original beacon coordinates, we discovered something impossible. Pierce's GPS track showed him hiking into the backcountry along the Lavercan Creek Trail for 6 hours, covering about 8 miles of challenging terrain. Normal hiking pattern, consistent pace, logical route following established trails and canyon systems. But then the track showed him retracing his exact route in reverse. Starting at 3:47 p.m., the exact moment his emergency beacon activated. Pierce's GPS began recording a return journey that followed his original route backwards, step by step, covering the same 8 miles back to his starting point at the trailhead. The return journey took exactly 6 hours, ending at 9:47 p.m. when the GPS unit stopped recording data. I've analyzed thousands of GPS tracks over my career, and I'd never seen anything like it. The precision was uncanny. Pierce's return route didn't just follow the same general path, but matched his original track within a few feet at every point. Every switchback, every stream crossing, every place where he deviated slightly from the main trail to avoid obstacles or take photographs. But here's what made it truly disturbing. According to the timestamps, Pierce had covered the return distance at exactly twice his original hiking speed. His inbound journey had taken 6 hours to cover 8 miles of difficult terrain, which was consistent with normal hiking pace in that area. But his return journey covered the same 8 miles in 3 hours, maintaining a pace that would be challenging for experienced trail runners, let alone someone carrying a full backpack through desert canyon country. We brought in additional resources to analyze the GPS data, thinking there might be technical malfunction or user error that could explain the anomalous readings. But multiple experts confirmed that the device had been functioning normally throughout Pierce's trip. The GPS track was accurate and complete, showing Pierce's exact movements from trailhead to his final position and back again. That's when we decided to examine Pierce's camera equipment. His digital camera had been found with his backpack at the beacon coordinates, still functional and containing hundreds of photographs from his backpacking trip. The images showed typical landscape photography, canyon formations, vegetation, geological features that matched his planned route. But the final series of photographs documented his return journey, and they showed something that challenged everything we understood about the case. Pierce appeared in many of these final images, captured using his camera's timer function or remote trigger. But in every single photograph from the return journey, he was walking backwards, not turning around to face the camera while hiking forward, but actually moving backwards through the terrain. His body position, his foot placement, even the way his backpack and equipment were oriented, all showed someone traveling in reverse through challenging desert landscape. The progression of images was consistent and logical. They documented his return route accurately, showing recognizable landmarks and terrain features in reverse order from his original journey. But Pierce himself was facing the wrong direction in every frame, as if he'd somehow learned to navigate complex canyon terrain while walking backward. I spent days studying those photographs, trying to find some rational explanation for what they showed. Maybe Pierce had been documenting his route for artistic purposes, taking creative shots that made it appear he was walking backwards. Maybe the camera's timer function had malfunctioned, capturing images at unexpected moments when he happened to be facing the wrong direction. But the technical evidence didn't support either explanation. The photographs were taken at regular intervals throughout the return journey, showing steady progression back toward the trailhead. The lighting was consistent with the time of day indicated by the GPS timestamps, and Pierce's movement in the images was fluid and purposeful, not the hesitant or awkward motion you'd expect from someone trying to navigate difficult terrain while facing backward. He appeared to be walking backwards through 8 miles of desert canyon with the same confidence and efficiency most people show when moving forward on familiar trails. We expanded the investigation, bringing in specialists from the National Park Service's Technical Rescue Team to examine the evidence. They confirmed our analysis but couldn't provide explanations for the anomalous GPS track or the photographs. People don't hike backwards through terrain like this, the team leader told me after reviewing all the data. Even if someone wanted to attempt it, they couldn't maintain that pace safely. The risk of serious injury would be enormous. Yet Pierce's photographs showed him doing exactly that, covering challenging ground while facing away from his direction of travel. The case remained active for 3 months before being transferred to local law enforcement as a missing person investigation. No body was ever recovered, no additional evidence emerged, and no witness came forward with information about Pierce's final days in the park. Officially, the case was classified as a probable wilderness accident with unusual circumstances that couldn't be fully explained by available evidence. But I kept copies of Pierce's GPS data and photographs, and I've continued to study them over the past year, trying to understand what happened during those final 6 hours of his documented journey. The technical evidence is clear and consistent. Pierce traveled 8 miles into the backcountry, activated his emergency beacon, then retraced his exact route at double speed while walking backwards, documenting the entire return journey with photographs that show him moving confidently through terrain that would challenge most people traveling forward. Then he vanished completely, leaving behind only his equipment and impossible evidence of a journey that defies rational explanation. What bothers me most is the precision of it all. The GPS track that matched his original route within feet, the photographs taken at regular intervals, the systematic documentation of a return journey that shouldn't have been possible to complete safely. It suggests purpose rather than accident, planning rather than emergency response, as if Pierce had intended to retrace his route in reverse and had prepared for the challenge of navigating backwards through desert canyon country. But why would someone plan such a dangerous undertaking? And how did he develop the skills necessary to travel efficiently through rough terrain while facing the wrong direction? I've been back to Pierce's route 4 times since his disappearance, always hoping to find some clue we missed during the original search. The terrain is exactly as challenging as the GPS data suggested: rocky, uneven, with numerous obstacles that would be difficult to navigate even while facing forward. Yet Pierce's photographs show him moving through this landscape backwards with apparent ease, covering ground at a pace that would be impressive under normal circumstances. Sometimes I wonder if Pierce discovered something during his outbound journey that required him to return while maintaining visual contact with whatever he'd encountered, something that made forward travel impossible or dangerous, forcing him to retreat while keeping his eyes on a threat we never identified. But that doesn't explain the precision of his route or the systematic way he documented the return journey. Someone retreating from danger wouldn't stop to set up camera timers for artistic photographs of their backwards movement. The evidence suggests Pierce chose to walk backwards through 8 miles of challenging terrain, documenting his progress methodically, then vanished without leaving any trace of where he went after reaching his starting point. The wilderness keeps its secrets, and some people choose to become part of those secrets rather than explain them. But I still wonder about Nathan Pierce. And I still wonder what kind of experience would motivate someone to turn their back on the direction they were traveling and retrace their steps through country that challenges people even when they can see where they're going. I'm Mike Anderson. I've been coordinating volunteer programs for Yosemite National Park for 10 years now, managing everything from trail maintenance crews to citizen science projects. It's mostly paperwork and logistics, matching volunteers with projects, processing background checks, making sure people have the right training for their assignments. Routine administrative work that keeps the park running smoothly. At least, that's what I thought, until I started going through Daniel Hoffman's personal effects in November of 2023. Hoffman had been one of our most reliable volunteers, a wildlife photographer from San Francisco who'd been documenting seasonal changes in the high country for over 3 years. Professional quality work, meticulous record keeping, the kind of volunteer who made my job easier by following protocols and producing excellent results. He'd been reported missing after failing to return from a solo photography expedition in the Tuolumne Meadows area. Search teams had found his vehicle at the Tenaya Lake trailhead, but no trace of Hoffman himself or his equipment. After 2 weeks of intensive searching, the case had been transferred to local law enforcement as a missing person investigation. As volunteer coordinator, I was responsible for processing Hoffman's personal effects that had been left in his vehicle. Standard procedure: catalog everything, look for emergency contacts, return personal items to family members when possible. But Hoffman had no listed emergency contacts, no family members in our volunteer database, No references who could be reached. No information about next of kin. He'd been volunteering with us for 3 years, but we knew almost nothing about his personal life beyond his photography work. What we did find was a detailed project portfolio in his vehicle's glove compartment. Professional binder with plastic sleeves containing shooting schedules, location maps, weather data, and hundreds of printed photographs documenting his work throughout the park. At first, it looked like standard project documentation. Hoffman had been systematic about planning his photography sessions, tracking optimal lighting conditions and seasonal timing for different locations. The kind of meticulous approach you'd expect from someone producing professional quality wildlife photography. But as I worked through the portfolio chronologically, I noticed something disturbing about the shooting schedules. They didn't just document past photography sessions. They projected forward, mapping out planned shoots for the next 8 months, including detailed notes about equipment requirements, weather forecasts, and expected wildlife activity. The final entry in the schedule was dated October 29, 2023, the exact day Hoffman had been reported missing. The notation read, "Final session, Tuolumne High Country, dawn light. Equipment retrieval instructions attached." I found the equipment retrieval instructions in a separate section of the portfolio. Detailed maps showing GPS coordinates for 5 different locations throughout the high country, each marked with notes about camera gear and personal belongings that had been cached at those sites. The instructions included specific timelines for retrieval, contact information for a storage facility in Modesto, and detailed inventories of equipment that should be recovered from each location. But what made it truly unsettling was the covering letter. Hoffman had written a formal memo, addressed to Park Administration, explaining that his volunteer work would be concluding on October 29th, and that arrangements had been made for equipment recovery. The letter was dated 6 months earlier, suggesting he'd been planning his departure for half a year before actually disappearing. The memo was professional and courteous, thanking the Park Service for the opportunity to contribute to wildlife documentation, but it offered no explanation for why he was ending his volunteer work, or where he planned to go after leaving Yosemite. Most disturbing was the final paragraph. "The project documentation in this portfolio represents the completion of my intended work in the park. All scheduled photography sessions have been conducted according to plan, and the final session will conclude my obligations as outlined in the original proposal." But I'd never seen an original proposal from Hoffman. He'd started volunteering through our standard application process, like any other citizen scientist. There was no record of him proposing any specific long-term project or committing to predetermined obligations. I brought the portfolio to my supervisor, who contacted the rangers handling Hoffman's missing person case. They were interested in the equipment retrieval instructions, thinking they might lead to finding Hoffman, or at least understanding what had happened to him. We organized recovery expeditions to the 5 locations marked on Hoffman's maps. Each site was in remote high country, accessible only by strenuous hiking and requiring technical mountaineering skills to reach safely. At the first location, near Cathedral Lakes, we found a waterproof cache containing camera equipment, camping gear, and personal belongings. Everything was organized with the same methodical precision shown in Hoffman's portfolio, labeled and inventoried according to his written instructions. The cache also contained additional documentation, detailed logs of wildlife observations, weather data, and hundreds of additional photographs showing the same high-quality work Hoffman had been producing throughout his time as a volunteer. But these weren't random wildlife shots. They were systematic documentation of specific locations and phenomena, organized by date and time with scientific precision. The photographs showed seasonal changes, animal behavior patterns, and environmental conditions across multiple years of observation. It looked less like hobby photography and more like formal research. We found similar caches at the other 4 locations. Each contained equipment, documentation, and photographs spanning multiple years of work. Together, they represented thousands of hours of field research and thousands of high-quality images documenting changes throughout Yosemite's high country ecosystem. The scope of Hoffman's work was staggering. He'd been conducting what amounted to a comprehensive environmental survey, using his volunteer photography assignments as cover for much more extensive research. But why the secrecy? And why had he planned his disappearance so carefully, timing it to coincide with the completion of his research? The equipment recovery led us to the storage facility in Modesto, where Hoffman had been renting a climate-controlled unit for over 2 years. The unit contained additional research materials, scientific equipment, and thousands more photographs, organized by location and date. But it also contained something that changed our understanding of who Hoffman really was. Academic credentials showing he held a doctorate in environmental science from UC Davis, published research papers on climate change impacts in mountain ecosystems, correspondence with universities and government agencies about long-term environmental monitoring projects. Daniel Hoffman wasn't just a volunteer photographer. He was a professional researcher who'd been conducting an unauthorized scientific study in Yosemite for over 3 years. The correspondence revealed that Hoffman had been collecting data for a climate change study that required long-term monitoring in protected wilderness areas, but he'd been unable to obtain official research permits due to bureaucratic complications and conflicting agency priorities. So he'd volunteered as a citizen photographer, using his legitimate volunteer status to access remote areas and conduct research without drawing attention to his real activities. The final pieces of the puzzle were in his personal journals, also stored at the facility. Hoffman had been documenting not just wildlife and environmental conditions, but also his growing concern about rapid changes he was observing in the high country ecosystem. His entries described accelerating environmental degradation, species population changes, and climate impacts that weren't being adequately documented through official channels. He'd become increasingly convinced that his unauthorized research represented the only comprehensive record of these changes. But his final journal entries, written in the months before his disappearance, showed a shift from scientific concern to something approaching obsession. "The data collection is complete," he wrote in September. 3 years of systematic observation have documented changes that should take decades to manifest. Something is accelerating the process beyond normal climate projections. His final entry, dated October 28th, was brief but unsettling. "Tomorrow concludes the observation period. The data must be preserved, but the observer can no longer remain objective. Time to remove the human variable from the equation." Search teams continued looking for Hoffman for another month, but found no additional trace of him. His research data was turned over to environmental scientists at UC Davis, who confirmed that his work represented valuable documentation of ecosystem changes in the Sierra Nevada, but they couldn't explain why Hoffman had chosen to disappear rather than publish his findings through normal academic channels. The case officially remains open, but no new evidence has emerged in the past year. Hoffman planned his disappearance with the same methodical precision he'd brought to his research, leaving behind detailed instructions for data recovery, but no explanation for his own fate. What bothers me most is the premeditation involved. Hoffman spent months planning his vanishing, timing it to coincide with the completion of his research project. He arranged for his data to be preserved and recovered, but made sure he wouldn't be around to answer questions about his unauthorized work. Sometimes I wonder if Hoffman discovered something in his research that made continuing his normal life impossible. His final journal entries suggested he'd observed environmental changes that exceeded his scientific expectations, phenomena that challenged his understanding of how ecosystems respond to climate stress. Maybe he found evidence of changes so rapid and dramatic that he couldn't bear to document them objectively anymore. Maybe he chose to become part of the wilderness he'd been studying, rather than continue observing its transformation from the outside. The high country he documented so carefully is still there, still changing according to the patterns he recorded so meticulously. But Daniel Hoffman is gone, disappeared as systematically as he'd planned, leaving behind only questions about what he saw during those final months of observation. His research continues to be valuable to scientists studying climate impacts in mountain ecosystems. But I still wonder what drove a professional researcher to abandon his career and vanish into the wilderness he'd spent 3 years documenting with such dedicated precision. I'm Jennifer Walsh. I've been a ranger at Acadia National Park for 13 years now, working mostly the carriage roads and backcountry areas where serious photographers like to set up for landscape work. You get to know the regulars after a while, people who come back season after season, working the same locations, chasing the same light. But nothing prepared me for the photographer I started encountering in the fall of 2018, or rather, the photographers. It began with a man named David Chen, maybe 40 years old, professional setup, with expensive camera gear and a methodical approach to his work. I first noticed him at Jordan Pond in early October, positioned at the same spot where landscape photographers always set up for the classic bubbles reflection shot. What caught my attention was his systematic approach. Most photographers work intuitively, responding to light and conditions as they change. But Chen was following a detailed checklist, working through specific shots at precise times of day, documenting each setup with notes in a weatherproof notebook. I approached him during a routine patrol, standard practice for checking permits and making sure people understand leave no trace principles. Chen was friendly and professional, showed me his valid photography permit, explained he was working on a long-term documentation project, focusing on seasonal changes throughout the park. Family tradition, he told me when I asked about his systematic approach. My uncle started this project years ago, documented every major viewpoint in the park through all 4 seasons. I'm continuing his work, using his notes and equipment to complete what he started. The equipment was impressive: professional camera bodies, multiple lenses, sturdy tripods, all well-maintained, but showing signs of extensive use. The kind of gear that represents serious investment and years of field work. Chen worked in the park for 2 weeks that fall, hitting all the major photographic locations according to his detailed schedule. I encountered him 6 or 7 times during regular patrols. Always found him exactly where his schedule indicated he'd be, always working through the same methodical process. Then he was gone, and I didn't think about him again until the following October. That's when I met Sarah Kim. Same location at Jordan Pond, same professional setup, same weatherproof notebook, with the same systematic approach to documentation. At first, I assumed Chen had returned for another season of work, but when I approached to check her permit, I realized this was a different person entirely. Kim was younger, maybe early 30s, but she was using identical equipment and following what appeared to be the same shooting schedule. When I commented on the similarity to work I'd seen the previous year, she explained that she'd inherited the project from her cousin. David finished his part of the documentation last year, she told me. Now it's my turn to continue the family work. Same equipment, same locations, same systematic approach that's been used for this project since it started. She showed me the notebook, and I recognized Chen's handwriting, mixed with older entries in different hands. The project appeared to span multiple years and multiple family members, each continuing where the previous person had left off. Kim worked the same 2-week schedule Chen had followed, visiting identical locations at the same times of day, taking what appeared to be the same photographs he'd captured the year before. Then she left, and I didn't see her again. The pattern continued for the next 4 years. October 2020 brought Michael Torres, who'd inherited the project from his sister Sarah. Same equipment, same notebook, same methodical approach to photographing the park's major viewpoints. In 2021, it was Lisa Park, continuing the work her brother Michael had completed. 2022 brought James Rodriguez, following up on his cousin Lisa's documentation. Each photographer spent exactly 2 weeks in the park, worked the same locations according to the same schedule, used identical equipment that showed increasing signs of age and wear. Each claimed to be continuing a long-term family project. but none could provide details about how the project had started or what its ultimate purpose might be. By the fifth year, I was paying closer attention to the pattern. The equipment was definitely the same from year to year. I recognized specific wear marks on camera bodies, particular scratches on lens housings, even the same frayed strap on one of the tripods. But the serial numbers, when I managed to check them discreetly, didn't match any stolen equipment databases. More strange was the notebook. Each photographer carried the same weatherproof journal, filled with handwritten notes, location maps, and shooting schedules. The handwriting changed from person to person, but the organizational system remained identical. Same shorthand notations, same method of tracking light conditions, same systematic approach to documenting seasonal changes. What bothered me most was the family relationships. None of the photographers resembled each other physically, despite claiming to be relatives. Their last names were different, their home addresses were scattered across different states, and their photography styles, while following the same systematic approach, showed individual variations that suggested different levels of experience and training. In 2023, I decided to investigate more thoroughly. When the October photographer arrived, a woman named Jennifer Martinez, who claimed to be continuing her cousin James's work, I made a point of spending more time observing her process. Martinez followed the same schedule and used the same equipment, but I noticed something I'd missed in previous years. She wasn't just taking photographs. She was also collecting small samples of vegetation, soil, and water from each location, storing them in labeled containers that she carried in a separate case. When I asked about the collection, she explained it was part of the documentation process her family had always followed. Environmental monitoring, she said. The photographs show visual changes over time, but the samples provide scientific data about ecological conditions. It's always been part of the project methodology, but environmental sampling requires permits that none of these photographers had obtained. When I mentioned this, Martinez seemed genuinely surprised, as if she'd assumed the photography permits covered all aspects of the project. I filed a report with my supervisor about the unauthorized sampling, which led to a broader investigation of the photography project. We contacted previous photographers using the information from their permit applications, trying to understand the scope and purpose of their work. That's when we discovered something disturbing. None of the contact information was current. Phone numbers had been disconnected, addresses led to vacant properties or people who'd never heard of the photographers. It was as if each person had vanished after completing their 2 weeks of work in the park. We expanded the investigation, working with law enforcement to trace the photographers' identities and backgrounds. The results were inconsistent and confusing. David Chen's photography permit had been issued to a legitimate person, but public records showed that David Chen had died in a car accident 3 months before his documented work in Acadia. Sarah Kim's permit was issued to someone who had never applied for park access and who claimed to have no knowledge of photography or any relatives named David Chen. Each subsequent photographer's identity led to similar contradictions. Valid permits issued to real people who either were deceased, had no memory of visiting Acadia, or denied any involvement in landscape photography. The equipment serial numbers, when we finally managed to trace them through manufacturer databases, led to purchase records from the 1980s and 1990s, cameras and lenses that had been sold decades earlier, with no current ownership records or registration information. But someone had been maintaining the equipment carefully, keeping it functional and updated with current memory cards and batteries. The investigation stalled when we realized we had no clear evidence of criminal activity. Photography permits had been issued properly, no park regulations had been violated beyond the minor sampling infractions, and no property damage or safety issues had been documented. But I kept copies of all the documentation, and I continued to watch for the annual October photographer. They stopped coming after 2023. This past October, I stationed myself at Jordan Pond during the time period when the photographer traditionally appeared. I waited for 2 weeks, checking all the locations according to the schedule I'd memorized from previous years. Nobody came. The long-term photography project whatever its real purpose, appears to have concluded. But I still have questions about who was really behind the work and why they maintained such an elaborate deception for over 5 years. What bothers me most is the systematic nature of it all. Someone organized a multi-year documentation project, recruited or compelled different people to carry it out each year, and maintained equipment that technically belonged to people who were dead or had no memory of owning it. The environmental samples that were collected were never submitted to any research institution. The photographs were never published or displayed anywhere we could find. The project produced years of systematic documentation with no apparent output or purpose. Sometimes I wonder if the photographers themselves knew what they were really doing, or if they were somehow convinced they were continuing legitimate family work. The conviction in their explanations suggested they genuinely believed the stories they told about inherited projects and family obligations. But someone was organizing their participation, providing equipment and detailed instructions, then ensuring they disappeared completely after completing their assigned work. The inheritance trail, whatever it really documented, is cold now. But I still patrol those locations every October. Still watch for systematic photographers working through detailed schedules with expensive equipment and weatherproof notebooks. The park looks the same as it always has. But I know someone spent years documenting changes I might not be able to see. Changes that required 5 different photographers, decades-old equipment, and a level of coordination that defies easy explanation. I keep the notebook pages I photocopied, hoping someday I'll understand what kind of inheritance passes from stranger to stranger, year after year, until the work is finally finished. I'm Paul Stevens. I've been a resource manager for the Washington State Department of Natural Resources for 15 years, overseeing wildlife habitat and public access across 3 million acres of state forest land. It's data-driven work, monitoring ecosystem health, tracking visitor usage patterns, analyzing environmental trends across vast wilderness areas. You learn to spot anomalies in the numbers, unusual patterns that might indicate problems or changes that need attention. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what I discovered in the Olympic Peninsula forests during the summer of 2023. It started with permit applications. We require professional photographers to obtain access permits for extended work in certain sensitive habitat areas, partly for environmental protection and partly to track usage patterns that might impact wildlife behavior. In June, I was reviewing quarterly permit data when I noticed an unusual clustering of applications for the same general area. 7 different photographers had requested access to a section of old-growth forest near Lake Quinault, all for overlapping time periods during July and August. Individual applications weren't unusual, but 7 separate photographers targeting the same relatively small area was statistically improbable. The location wasn't particularly scenic by Olympic Peninsula standards. No dramatic viewpoints, no rare wildlife concentrations, no unique geological features that would naturally attract multiple photographers. I pulled the individual permit files to understand what was drawing so much interest to this specific location. Each photographer had provided detailed project descriptions as required, but their explanations were remarkably similar. They all described intentions to document subtle environmental changes and transitional forest dynamics in old-growth ecosystems. Professional language that suggested serious research rather than casual nature photography. But none of them had academic affiliations or scientific credentials that would typically drive such specialized work. More strange was the timing. Each photographer had requested slightly different access periods, but when I mapped out their schedules, they formed a continuous sequence. One photographer would finish their work just as the next one was scheduled to begin, creating an unbroken chain of documentation from July through September. The coordination was too precise to be coincidental, but there was no evidence the photographers knew each other or were working together. Their applications came from different states. Their emergency contacts were unrelated, and their equipment lists showed different camera systems and approaches. I decided to visit the location myself to understand what was attracting so much professional interest. The area was accessible by a Forest Service road that terminated at a small parking area, then a 2-mile hike through typical Pacific Northwest old-growth forest, Douglas fir and western red cedar, dense understory of ferns and moss. The kind of environment that looks spectacular to casual visitors, but doesn't offer obvious subjects for specialized photography. The specific coordinates from the permit applications led to a small clearing, maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by old-growth trees. Nothing remarkable about the space, no unusual vegetation, no distinctive geological features, no obvious wildlife habitat that would justify extended documentation. But the clearing showed clear signs of recent and systematic use. Multiple camera positions had been established around the perimeter, marked by areas where tripods had compressed the forest floor over extended periods. The positions were evenly spaced, creating a rough circle around the clearing's center, each offering a slightly different angle of the same unremarkable open space. I spent 2 hours in the clearing, trying to understand what photographers might be documenting there. The lighting was pleasant but not exceptional, filtered through the forest canopy in ways that changed gradually throughout the day. The vegetation was healthy and typical for the region. No wildlife activity beyond the occasional bird or small mammal. Nothing that would justify multiple professional photographers spending weeks in systematic documentation. I returned to the office and contacted several of the permit holders, hoping to understand their specific interests in the location. The conversations were professionally cordial, but increasingly puzzling. Each photographer described being drawn to the location by reports of interesting transitional phenomena they'd heard about through informal photography networks. But none could identify the source of these reports or provide specific details about what phenomena they were expecting to document. "It's hard to explain," one photographer told me. "Something about the way light behaves in that particular clearing, how it changes throughout the day in ways that aren't typical for forest environments. I heard about it from another photographer, but I can't remember exactly who or when." Similar responses from the other permit holders. Vague references to interesting light conditions or unusual environmental dynamics, but no specific information about what they hoped to capture or who had originally identified the location as noteworthy. By late July, I was checking the location regularly during my field inspections. Each time I visited, I found evidence of recent photography activity, fresh tripod marks, areas where equipment had been positioned, signs that people were spending extended periods observing the clearing. But I never encountered any of the photographers themselves. Their vehicles appeared in the parking area according to their permitted schedules, but my visits to the clearing during various times of day never coincided with active photography sessions. It was as if they were somehow avoiding my presence while conducting their systematic work. In early August, I decided to spend a full day at the location, arriving before dawn and remaining until after sunset to observe whatever was drawing so much professional attention. The day was typical for the season: overcast morning clearing to partial sun, comfortable temperatures, light forest breeze. I documented changes in lighting conditions throughout the day, took photographs from the same positions the permitted photographers had been using, tried to see what they might be seeing. Nothing unusual occurred. The clearing remained empty and unremarkable, showing the kind of gradual lighting changes you'd expect in any forest environment. By late afternoon, I was convinced the location had been chosen for reasons I didn't understand, possibly related to some aspect of forest photography I wasn't trained to recognize. Then I found the equipment. Around 5 p.m., as the light was beginning to fade, I discovered a circle of abandoned tripods positioned around the clearing's perimeter. Professional-grade equipment, exactly positioned at the camera locations I'd identified from previous visits, all extended to the same height and angled toward the center of the clearing. 12 tripods in total, each supporting camera equipment that had been left behind. The cameras were still active, their displays showing they were powered on and ready for operation. Memory cards were installed, Batteries showed full charge. Everything configured for immediate use, but no photographers were present. I approached each setup carefully, documenting the equipment with my own camera before disturbing anything. The tripods were positioned with mathematical precision, forming a perfect circle around the clearing, with each camera pointed toward the exact center of the open space. The equipment represented thousands of dollars in professional photography gear, left unattended in a remote forest location with no security or protection from weather. I spent an hour searching the surrounding forest for any sign of the photographers who'd abandoned their equipment. No tracks leading away from the clearing, no sounds of human activity, no response to my calls. The forest was silent except for normal wildlife sounds and wind through the canopy. As darkness approached, I made the decision to remain overnight, hoping the photographers would return for their equipment. I set up a basic camp at the edge of the clearing and maintained watch throughout the night. Nothing happened. The cameras remained positioned and active, their displays providing the only artificial light in the forest darkness. No one returned to claim the equipment or check on its operation. At dawn, I began the process of documenting and securing the abandoned gear. Each camera contained memory cards with thousands of images, all showing identical views of the clearing's center from their respective positions around the perimeter. The images spanned several weeks, suggesting the equipment had been operating continuously, taking photographs at regular intervals throughout day and night. But they all showed the same empty clearing from the same angles, creating an enormous archive of documentation of absolutely nothing. I contacted my supervisor and law enforcement to report the abandoned equipment. The investigation that followed confirmed that the gear belonged to the permitted photographers, but attempts to contact them were unsuccessful. Phone numbers had been disconnected. Addresses led to forwarding services that provided no current information. The photographers had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed, leaving behind only their expensive equipment and thousands of photographs of an empty forest clearing. The case was eventually closed as abandoned property, with the equipment processed according to state protocols. No crime had been committed, no missing persons reports were filed, and no evidence suggested anything other than unusual behavior by a group of photographers who'd chosen to abandon their work. But I kept copies of the images from the memory cards, and I've continued to visit the clearing regularly over the past year. The location remains exactly as unremarkable as it was during my first visit, showing no changes or phenomena that would justify the systematic documentation it received. What bothers me most is the coordination involved. 12 photographers, working independently according to their permit applications, had somehow arranged their equipment in a perfect circle around the clearing. The precision suggested planning and communication, but we found no evidence of contact between them. More disturbing is what they were documenting. Thousands of images of the same empty space, taken from multiple angles over extended periods, as if they were waiting for something to appear, or were recording changes invisible to casual observation. Sometimes I stand in the center of that clearing and try to see what drew so much professional attention. The forest looks exactly as it should, healthy, peaceful, unremarkable in every way I can measure or observe. But 12 photographers thought differently. They invested weeks of work and thousands of dollars in equipment to document something I can't see, then vanished without explanation, leaving behind only evidence of their collective focus on empty ground. The clearing is still there, still empty, still showing no signs of the phenomena that attracted so much systematic attention. But I wonder what those photographers saw, or what they were expecting to see, that made them arrange their cameras in a perfect circle and wait for something that may never have appeared. I'm Sarah Kim. I've been a backcountry specialist for Rocky Mountain National Park for 9 years now, working primarily in the remote sections where search and rescue operations require technical expertise and wilderness experience. It's demanding work, analyzing terrain, coordinating recovery efforts, processing evidence from missing person cases. You learn to read the stories that equipment and locations tell about what happened to people who don't make it home. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what I found on Marcus Webb's camera in September of 2023. Webb had been reported missing after failing to return from what his family described as a routine day hike in the Wild Basin area. Experienced hiker, proper equipment, detailed plan shared with his wife about hiking to Ouzel Falls and returning before dark. When he didn't come home that evening, his family contacted Park Dispatch, and we initiated standard search protocols. The initial search covered his planned route systematically: the Wild Basin Trail to Ouzel Falls, about 3 miles each way with moderate elevation gain. Webb's vehicle was found at the Wild Basin trailhead, exactly where he'd said it would be, locked and showing no signs of disturbance. Search teams worked the trail for 3 days, checking every overlook, side trail, and potential hazard area. The route to Ouzel Falls is well maintained and heavily traveled, not the kind of terrain where experienced hikers typically encounter serious problems. We found Webb's day pack on the 4th day, about half a mile past Ouzel Falls, in an area that wasn't part of his planned route. The pack was sitting upright beside the trail, as if he'd set it down intentionally rather than dropped it during an emergency. Inside the pack was standard day hike gear, water, energy bars, first aid kit, rain jacket, everything you'd expect from someone planning a few hours on well-marked trails. But also his camera, a professional digital model that seemed excessive for casual day hike photography. Webb himself was never found. Search teams expanded their coverage area, brought in additional resources, even used helicopter reconnaissance to scan terrain that couldn't be reached on foot. After 2 weeks, the active search was suspended, and the case was transferred to local law enforcement as a missing person investigation. As the backcountry specialist who'd coordinated the search, I was responsible for processing Webb's recovered equipment and documenting it as evidence. Standard procedure involves checking camera memory cards for images that might provide clues about the missing person's final activities. Webb's camera contained 347 photographs. At first, I assumed he'd been an enthusiastic photographer who'd taken hundreds of shots during his hike. Common behavior for people visiting scenic areas, they document everything, often taking multiple exposures of the same subjects. But when I started reviewing the images chronologically, I realized something was wrong. Every single photograph showed the exact same scene. Not similar views from slightly different angles, but literally identical images. Same composition, same lighting, same shadows cast by trees and rocks. The scene showed a small clearing in the forest, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by aspen and pine trees, typical of the Wild Basin area. The images were technically perfect sharp focus, proper exposure, professional quality that suggested Webb knew how to use his equipment effectively. But they were all identical, as if he'd somehow taken the same photograph over and over again without moving his camera or changing any settings. I checked the metadata embedded in each image file, and that's when the situation became truly disturbing. The photographs had been taken at precise 1-minute intervals, starting at 6:43 a.m. on September 15th and continuing for 50 hours and 4 minutes straight. The final image was time-stamped at 8:47 a.m. on September 17th. 50 hours of continuous photography, documenting the same unchanging scene, minute by minute. But according to Webb's family, he'd planned only a day hike. His wife expected him home by evening on September 15th. He'd carried supplies for a few hours on the trail, not equipment or provisions for a multi-day expedition. I brought the timeline discrepancy to my supervisor, thinking there might be an error in the camera's internal clock or some technical malfunction that could explain the anomalous timestamps. We had the camera examined by digital forensic specialists who confirmed that the device had been functioning normally throughout the documented period. The timestamps were accurate, the images were genuine, and there was no evidence of technical problems that could account for the repetitive photography. Marcus Webb had somehow spent 50 continuous hours photographing the same forest clearing, taking pictures at exact 1-minute intervals. Despite planning only a brief day hike, I contacted Webb's family to verify the timeline and his intended plans. His wife was certain about his schedule. He'd left home at 5:30 a.m. on September 15th, planning to hike to Uzell Falls and return by mid-afternoon. He'd taken minimal supplies and had mentioned wanting to be home in time for dinner. She also confirmed that Webb wasn't an obsessive photographer. He enjoyed taking pictures during hikes, but casually, not with the systematic precision suggested by the camera evidence. Marcus would take maybe 20 or 30 photos during a typical hike, she told me. Pictures of waterfalls, wildlife, scenery he found interesting, but he'd never spent hours photographing the same thing repeatedly. That's not his personality at all. The forensics analysis revealed additional disturbing details about the photograph sequence. While the images appeared identical at first glance, careful comparison showed subtle variations in lighting that corresponded to the passage of time. Early morning photos showed dawn light filtering through the forest canopy. Midday images were brighter with different shadow patterns. Evening shots showed the warm light of approaching sunset. The photographs documented natural lighting changes across multiple day and night cycles, proving that Webb had indeed been present at the location for the full 50-hour period, continuously taking pictures of the same clearing as time passed around him. But there was no evidence he'd moved from his position during the entire period. The camera angle never changed, the composition remained identical, and there were no images of Webb setting up camp, eating, or conducting any of the activities you'd expect during an extended stay in the wilderness. More puzzling was the question of power supply. Professional cameras typically run for 8 to 10 hours of continuous operation before requiring battery changes, but Webb's camera had somehow functioned for 50 hours straight, taking pictures every minute without interruption. The investigation expanded to include the specific location where Webb's photographs had been taken. Using GPS data from the image files, we identified the clearing he'd been documenting and organized an expedition to examine the site. The location was about 2 miles from where Webb's day pack had been found, in an area that wasn't visible from any established trails. Reaching it required bushwhacking through dense forest and navigating terrain that would be challenging even for experienced hikers. When we reached the clearing, we found evidence of prolonged human presence, an area where someone had stood for an extended period, vegetation compressed in a pattern consistent with minimal movement over many hours. But no campsite, no equipment cache, no signs of the kind of preparation you'd need for a multi-day stay in remote wilderness. What we did find was disturbing in its precision. A single set of footprints, clearly defined in soft soil at the center of the clearing. The prints showed someone standing in the exact position from which Webb's photographs had been taken, facing the same direction, apparently motionless for long enough to leave deep impressions in the ground. The prints were surrounded by a perfect circle of disturbed vegetation, as if Webb had been rotating slowly in place while maintaining his photographic position. But there were no tracks leading to or from the clearing, no evidence of how he'd reached the location or where he'd gone afterward. The case remained active for 6 months before being officially classified as a missing person with unusual circumstances. Webb's body was never recovered. No additional evidence emerged, and no explanation was found for the 50-hour photography session. But I kept copies of all the photographs, and I've studied them extensively over the past year, trying to understand what Webb was documenting during those 50 hours alone in the forest. The images show absolutely nothing changing. Same trees, same arrangement of rocks and fallen logs, same patches of sunlight and shadow moving predictably across the forest floor. If Webb was waiting for something to happen, or trying to capture some specific phenomenon, there's no evidence of success in the photographic record. Yet he stood in one spot for more than 2 full days, taking pictures every minute, apparently without eating, sleeping, or attending to basic human needs. The physical and psychological stamina required for such behavior exceeds normal human capabilities. What bothers me most is the systematic nature of the photography. Webb wasn't randomly clicking the shutter, he was following a precise schedule, taking pictures at exact 1-minute intervals for 50 hours. The regularity suggests purpose rather than obsession, planning rather than compulsion. But what kind of purpose requires someone to document an empty forest clearing every minute for more than 2 days? And what happened to Webb after he completed his impossible photography project? I've been back to the clearing multiple times, always hoping to understand what drew Webb to that specific location and kept him there for 50 hours of continuous documentation. The forest looks exactly as it does in his photographs, peaceful, unremarkable, showing the kind of gradual natural changes you'd expect in any woodland environment. Sometimes I stand in the exact spot where Webb positioned himself and try to see what he was seeing, what kept him focused on the same view for 50 hours straight. The forest is beautiful, but not unusually so, showing nothing that would justify such intensive documentation. But I know Webb saw something there that I can't see, something that required precise timing and systematic observation. 3,000 identical photographs represent dedication to documenting something I don't understand, in a location that continues to look exactly as empty and peaceful as it did when he first pointed his camera at it. The wilderness keeps its secrets, and sometimes people become part of those secrets rather than solve them. But I still wonder what Marcus Webb was really photographing during those 50 hours, and I still wonder if whatever he was documenting is still there, waiting for someone else to notice it and start taking pictures every minute until they too disappear into the same mystery that claimed him. I'm Doug Peters. I've been an interpretive ranger at Death Valley National Park for 14 years, working mostly with visitors and researchers who come here to study or document the desert ecosystem. It's educational work, helping people understand the landscape, coordinating with scientists and photographers, making sure research activities follow park regulations. You meet a lot of dedicated professionals who spend months documenting changes in one of the harshest environments in North America. But nothing prepared me for my interview with Alex Chen in January of 2024. Chen had been the research assistant for Dr. Robert Kellerman, a nature photographer and environmental scientist who'd been working on a long-term documentation project in the park's backcountry. Kellerman had obtained permits for extended desert research, studying how extreme climate conditions affect plant and animal adaptation over multiple seasons. The project had been running for 18 months when Kellerman was reported missing after failing to return from a solo photography expedition in the Panamint Range. Search teams found his vehicle at a remote trailhead, but no trace of Kellerman himself or his equipment in the surrounding desert. Chen contacted our office 3 days after the search was suspended, saying he had information about Kellerman's final weeks that might be relevant to understanding his disappearance. As the interpretive ranger who'd been coordinating with their research project, I arranged to meet with Chen at our visitor center. Chen was in his mid-20s, graduate student type, clearly shaken by his mentor's disappearance. He'd been working with Kellerman for over a year, helping with equipment, data collection, and field logistics for the desert documentation project. Dr. Kellerman changed during the final month, Chen told me during our interview. He became obsessed with what he called finishing the series, always talking about deadlines and appointments that weren't on any schedule I knew about. According to Chen, Kellerman's research had been proceeding normally through the fall of 2023. Systematic documentation of desert flora and fauna, careful observation of seasonal changes, the kind of methodical work you'd expect from a professional scientist with environmental training. But sometime in December, Kellerman's behavior shifted dramatically. He started working alone more often, Chen explained, sending me back to base camp while he continued photographing by himself. When he'd return, he'd be agitated, talking about needing more time to complete something important. Chen described Kellerman muttering about keeping the appointment and needing to finish the series before the deadline. But when Chen asked for details about these commitments, Kellerman would become evasive or change the subject entirely. I thought he was under pressure from grant funding or publication deadlines, Chen said, Academic research involves a lot of external pressures that assistants don't always see, but his behavior was getting increasingly erratic. The most disturbing aspect of Chen's account involved Kellerman's final week of work. He was photographing shadows, Chen told me. Not using shadows for artistic effect in landscape photography, but actually documenting shadow patterns as if they were his primary subject. He'd spend hours positioning himself to capture his own shadow under different lighting conditions. Chen had questioned this unusual focus, but Kellerman insisted it was part of his environmental documentation. Something about how shadow patterns revealed information about solar angles and seasonal changes that wasn't visible through other observation methods. But he was obsessive about it. Chen continued, taking hundreds of shots of the same shadow positions, adjusting his camera settings minutely, like he was trying to capture something specific that kept eluding him. Kellerman's final solo expedition had been planned as a 3-day photography session in a remote section of the Panamint Range. He'd told Chen the trip would complete his shadow documentation series and fulfill his commitment to the appointment, though he never explained what that meant. The morning he left, Dr. Kellerman seemed relieved, Chen recalled, like someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden and was finally going to set it down. He said the project would be finished by the time he returned, and we could start planning our next research phase. Kellerman never returned from that expedition. Chen had brought Kellerman's backup equipment and recent work files, hoping they might provide clues about his disappearance. I spent several hours reviewing the material with him, trying to understand what Kellerman had been working on during his final weeks. The photographic files confirmed Chen's description. Hundreds of images documenting shadow patterns under various lighting conditions, with particular focus on Kellerman's own shadow cast by different angles of desert sunlight. The progression of images was technically sophisticated, but increasingly strange. Early shots showed normal landscape photography, with shadows used as compositional elements. But the later images focused exclusively on shadow documentation, often showing Kellerman's silhouette in various poses and positions. The final series of photographs, taken during Kellerman's last week at base camp, showed something that made me deeply uncomfortable. In these images, Kellerman had positioned himself to photograph his own shadow against desert sand and rock surfaces. But the shadow appeared to be disconnected from his physical position, cast at angles that didn't correspond to the sun's location or his body's orientation. Even more disturbing, the shadow seemed to be moving independently in sequential shots taken seconds apart. While Kellerman remained stationary, his shadow appeared to be walking, gesturing, or changing position in ways that defied the physical laws of light and projection. I brought the images to our chief ranger, who consulted with photography experts about possible technical explanations. Double exposure, digital manipulation, unusual lighting conditions that might create optical illusions. But analysis of the image files showed no signs of alteration or technical problems. The camera had been functioning normally. The lighting conditions were consistent with the time and location data, and the shadows were captured exactly as they appeared to the camera sensor. Robert Kellerman had somehow been photographing his own shadow as it moved independently of his body. The investigation into Kellerman's disappearance continued for 2 more weeks, but no additional evidence emerged. His research permits were officially closed, and the case was transferred to county authorities as a missing person investigation. But Chen continued to contact me periodically, sharing additional details about Kellerman's final months that he remembered during the weeks following our interview. Dr. Kellerman kept talking about completing the obligation, Chen told me during one of these follow-up conversations. Like he owed something to someone, and the shadow photography was how he planned to pay it back. Chen also revealed that Kellerman had been receiving mail at their remote research station letters, with no return address, that would arrive by general delivery at the nearest post office, sometimes requiring 50-mile drives to collect. He never showed me the letters, Chen said, but after reading them, he'd always become more focused on the shadow work, more determined to complete the series according to some schedule I wasn't allowed to know about. The most unsettling detail came during Chen's final contact with our office in March of 2024. "I've been going through Dr. Kellerman's research files more carefully," he told me. "The shadow photography project wasn't part of his original research proposal. It started in December, right after he received the first letter. Everything before that was normal environmental documentation." Chen had found evidence that Kellerman's shadow photography had been commissioned work, responding to specific instructions from an unknown correspondent who'd been directing his activities during those final weeks. Someone was telling him what to photograph, when to do it, and how to document the results, Chen explained. The Shadow series wasn't scientific research. It was fulfilling some kind of contract or agreement that Dr. Kellerman had never mentioned to me. But Chen never found the letters themselves, and Kellerman's correspondence records provided no clues about who had been directing his final project. The case officially remains open but inactive. Kellerman's disappearance is classified as a probable wilderness accident, though the unusual circumstances surrounding his final weeks continue to generate questions that have no clear answers. I've kept copies of Kellerman's shadow photographs, and I review them periodically, trying to understand what he was documenting during those final weeks in the desert. The images are technically proficient and systematically organized, showing the work of someone following specific instructions rather than pursuing personal artistic vision. But they also show something that shouldn't be possible: shadows that move independently of the objects casting them, captured with scientific precision by a researcher who vanished while completing an unknown obligation to an unidentified correspondent. What bothers me most is Chen's description of Kellerman's relief during his final morning, like someone who'd been carrying a burden and was finally going to set it down, as if completing the shadow documentation series would release him from some commitment he'd never chosen to make. Sometimes I wonder if Kellerman did complete his obligation, if he fulfilled whatever agreement had been directing his work during those final weeks. And sometimes I wonder if the appointment he kept was with the same shadow he'd been photographing, the shadow that appeared to walk away from his body in those final, impossible images. The desert keeps its secrets, and some people choose to become part of those secrets rather than explain them. But I still think about Robert Kellerman, and I still wonder what kind of appointment requires someone to document their own shadow moving independently through the desert, then disappear into the same landscape they'd been systematically photographing for 18 months. I'm Carol Martinez. I've been a fire prevention officer with the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection for 12 years, working primarily in the Sierra Nevada foothills, where wildfire risk requires constant monitoring and post-fire assessment. It's technical work evaluating burn patterns, assessing regeneration potential, documenting damage for recovery planning. You spend a lot of time alone in areas where fire has stripped away everything familiar, leaving behind landscapes that look like the surface of another planet. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered in the Mendocino burn area during my assessment work in March of 2024. The Rabbit Creek fire had burned through 8,000 acres the previous summer, one of dozens of smaller fires that never made national news but still devastated local ecosystems. My job was conducting a 6-month post-fire assessment, documenting recovery patterns and identifying areas that might need intervention to prevent erosion or invasive species establishment. The burn area was typical for the region: mixed conifer forest, reduced to blackened snags, and scattered patches of surviving vegetation. Fire moves unpredictably through forest landscape, creating a mosaic of total destruction, alongside areas that emerge relatively unscathed. I was working through a section of heavy burn about 3 miles from the nearest access road when I noticed something unusual attached to a fire-killed pine tree: a photograph. Professional quality wildlife image, mounted in a weather-resistant frame and secured to the trunk about 6 feet off the ground. The image showed a red-tailed hawk in flight, captured with the kind of technical skill and expensive equipment that suggested serious nature photography. Finding abandoned items in burn areas isn't unusual. Fire forces people to evacuate quickly, leaving behind camping gear, personal belongings, sometimes valuable equipment. But a carefully mounted and protected photograph seemed deliberate rather than accidental. I documented the find with GPS coordinates and continued my assessment work, figuring I'd report it as recovered property when I returned to the office. A quarter-mile further into the burn area, I found another photograph. This one showed a family of deer browsing in a meadow, mounted on a different burned tree with the same weather-resistant framing. Professional quality again, with the kind of patience and skill required to capture natural animal behavior in perfect lighting conditions. Two mounted photographs in a burned forest started to feel like a pattern rather than coincidence. Over the next 4 hours, I found 17 more photographs. Each image was professionally mounted and strategically positioned on fire-killed trees throughout the burn area. Wildlife photography exclusively bears elk, various bird species, smaller mammals captured in natural settings with exceptional technical quality. But what made the discovery truly unsettling was the arrangement. The photographs weren't randomly scattered through the forest, but positioned to create a deliberate path through the burn area. Following the sequence led deeper into the forest, away from access roads and toward more remote terrain. I started documenting each photograph systematically, noting GPS coordinates and taking pictures of the mounting systems. Someone had invested significant time and effort in creating this outdoor gallery, selecting specific trees and positions with careful consideration for visibility and protection from weather. The mounting hardware was professional-grade metal brackets and weatherproof frames designed for long-term outdoor exposure. This wasn't a temporary installation or artistic statement, but infrastructure meant to last for years in harsh forest conditions. As I followed the photographic trail deeper into the burn area, I noticed that the images were becoming more recent, based on digital quality and printing characteristics. The early photographs in the sequence showed slightly older technology and paper composition, while the later images had the sharp detail and color accuracy of current professional equipment. Someone had been adding to this gallery over time, expanding the collection and extending the path deeper into the forest. The 17th photograph was mounted on a massive ponderosa pine that had somehow survived the fire with minimal damage. The image showed a golden eagle perched on a rocky outcrop, captured during the golden hour when lighting creates perfect conditions for raptor photography. But beyond this tree, the photographic trail ended. I continued following the implied path for another half-mile, checking every tree and possible mounting location. No more photographs, no additional infrastructure, no signs of human activity in the deeper forest, until I reached the clearing. The open space was maybe 40 feet across, surrounded by burned snags that created natural boundaries for the area. In the center of the clearing, arranged in a perfect circle, were 12 camera tripods, professional equipment, high-end tripods that would cost several $100s each, all extended to the same height, all angled toward the center of the circle, all equipped with quick-release plates as if cameras had recently been removed. The tripods were clean and functional, showing no signs of fire damage or weather exposure, despite being in an area that had burned 6 months earlier. Someone had been maintaining this equipment, keeping it ready for immediate use. I approached the installation carefully, documenting everything before disturbing the arrangement. Each tripod was positioned with mathematical precision, creating 12 equally spaced points around the circle's perimeter. The setup suggested group photography sessions, multiple photographers working simultaneously to document the same central subject. But there was nothing in the center of the circle, just bare ground where fire had cleared away all vegetation, leaving behind a flat area about 10 feet in diameter. I spent 2 hours examining the site, looking for clues about who had created this installation and what they'd been photographing. The tripod positions showed signs of repeated use, compressed soil, wear patterns on the leg spikes, areas where equipment had been set up multiple times in exactly the same locations. But I found no personal items, no equipment caches, No signs of the photographers who'd been using this remote location for what appeared to be systematic group documentation sessions. That evening, I researched the wildlife photographs I'd found, trying to identify the photographers through image analysis and metadata. Professional wildlife photography is a small community, and exceptional work usually has recognizable styles or signatures. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. Using reverse image searches and photography databases, I identified several of the mounted photographs as work by photographers who'd been reported missing over the past decade. Images by Marcus Chen, who disappeared in the area in 2016. Photographs by Sarah Park, missing since 2019. Work by 3 other photographers whose disappearances had been investigated by different law enforcement agencies across multiple years. The Wildlife Gallery in the Burned Forest was a collection of final works by photographers who'd vanished while working in remote wilderness areas. I contacted the sheriff's office and provided all my documentation from the site. They reopened several missing person cases and organized expeditions to examine the photographic gallery and tripod installation. Additional investigation revealed that the mounting hardware and weather protection had been installed over multiple years, with newer photographs added to the collection as recently as the month before my discovery. Someone had been maintaining and expanding the gallery continuously, even after the area had burned. The tripod circle showed evidence of recent use despite being in a location that had been inaccessible during fire suppression operations. 12 photographers had somehow been working at the site after the fire, documenting something that required precise positioning and group coordination. But search teams found no additional evidence of human presence in the area. No campsites, no equipment caches, no trails leading to or from the installation. The case remained active for 3 months before being transferred to federal authorities due to the multi-jurisdictional nature of the missing person cases. The FBI investigation confirmed the connection between the mounted photographs and disappeared photographers, but found no explanations for how their work had been collected and displayed in such a remote location. The most disturbing discovery came during forensic analysis of the tripod positions. Soil samples from each tripod location contained trace elements that suggested the equipment had been used recently and repeatedly over several years. But the chemical composition also showed compounds that weren't consistent with normal photographic equipment or wilderness exposure. The analysis suggested that whatever had been photographed in the center of the circle had left residues that persisted in the soil despite fire exposure and weather conditions. But no one could identify what substance would create such persistent chemical signatures or why it would require documentation by 12 photographers working simultaneously from predetermined positions. The photographic gallery was eventually dismantled as evidence, but the tripod circle remains exactly as I found it. Federal authorities decided not to disturb the installation, treating it as an active crime scene pending further investigation. I've been back to the site 4 times since my initial discovery, always hoping to understand what 12 photographers had been documenting with such systematic precision. The clearing looks exactly as it did when I first found it: empty ground, surrounded by burned trees, showing no signs of whatever phenomenon had required such coordinated observation. But sometimes I stand in the center of that circle and try to imagine what the photographers were seeing through their lenses. What had drawn them to position their cameras with such mathematical accuracy around the same central point? The wilderness keeps its secrets, and some of those secrets involve people who disappear while trying to document phenomena that leave behind only chemical traces and carefully arranged equipment. But I still wonder about those 12 tripods, still pointed toward empty ground, still waiting for photographers who vanished while capturing images of something I can't see or understand. The gallery of their final works formed a path through the burned forest, leading to a circle where their cameras once recorded something that required 12 different perspectives to document properly. Whatever they were photographing left behind residues that persist in the soil, evidence of phenomena that demanded the attention of professional photographers who never returned to explain what they'd been capturing in that remote clearing.